The ladle hit the dirt 2 inches from her feet. Not dropped. Thrown. Silas Crow didn't even look at her when he did it. He just stepped out of the bunkhouse, sized her up the way a man sizes up a horse he's already decided not to buy, and let that tin ladle fly like she was supposed to catch it. She was supposed to be grateful. Behind him, 3 ranch hands spilled out the door, and the laughter started before the ladle even stopped spinning in the dust. "Kitchen's not a charity house," Silas said. One man, broad-shouldered, missing a front tooth, leaned against the post and shook his head slowly. "Lord Almighty, she can barely feed herself." More laughter. Evelyn Rourke stood there with 4 days of Wyoming dust on her boots, 2.14 in her satchel, and nothing left in the world that could accurately be called a plan. She was 31 years old, a widow, and her body heavy, road-worn, aching in places she'd stopped naming, had carried her across 100 miles of frontier terrain that would have turned back most men half her size. She looked down at the ladle. She looked at the men laughing, and she bent down and picked it up. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, not strong enough, not small enough, not the right kind of enough, then this story belongs to you. Stay with me until the end, because Evelyn Rourke's story is just getting started. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. And leave a like, then drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that dusty yard in Wyoming, August of 1884, and find out what happens when the woman nobody believed in refuses to put that ladle back down. She had not intended to arrive looking like she did. That was the first thing, the small embarrassment that sat underneath all the larger ones she had planned. When she set out from Cheyenne to arrive presentable, clean dress, hair pinned properly, the kind of entrance a woman makes when she's asking for honest work and wants to be taken seriously. 4 days had destroyed that plan entirely. The wagon she'd paid $2 to ride had broken an axle somewhere outside of Rawlins, and the driver, a phlegmatic man named Beaufort who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco, had apologized with such genuine misery that she couldn't even be properly angry at him. She'd walked the last 30 miles in stages a few miles at dawn, before the heat became punishing, a rest in whatever shade she could find, a few more miles in the cooling afternoon. She'd found water twice. She'd eaten the last of her biscuits somewhere around the second day, when she'd miscalculated how far she still had to go. She arrived at Blackridge Ranch dehydrated, dusty, and substantially past the point where dignity felt like a thing worth protecting. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected. She'd heard about it in Cheyenne. Somebody's cousin had worked there briefly, mentioned that the owner, a man named Gideon Hale, was known for running a tight operation but paying fair wages. She'd also heard that he was currently without a cook, his last one having quit 2 weeks prior over a dispute that nobody could adequately explain. She had thought, "I can cook." She had thought, "That is something I know how to do." She had not thought particularly carefully about what she looked like when she arrived, or what Silas Crow would see when he stepped out of the bunkhouse and found her standing in his yard. He saw a fat woman. That was all. That was the entire calculation, done in under 3 seconds. And everything that followed the ladle, the laughter, the comment about whether she could feed herself, came directly out of that calculation, without anything else being weighed. Evelyn knew this. She had been the subject of this particular calculation many times. She had learned through necessity rather than preference to let it run its course before she said anything. Picked up the ladle. "I'm looking for Gideon Hale," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. 4 days in the sun had left her throat rough and dry, but she'd done enough talking to difficult men that steadiness was more habit than effort at this point. "I heard he needs a cook." He needed a cook, Silas said, 2 weeks ago, before he gave up on the idea. "I'd like to speak with him." "You can turn yourself around and walk back the way you came." The man with the missing tooth laughed again, lower this time, like he was settling in for entertainment. 2 more hands had drifted out from somewhere she could feel them behind her, which was worse than having them in front. Men behind you meant they were blocking the path back, even if that wasn't why they'd moved there. She stood with the ladle in her hand and looked at Silas Crow directly, which she knew he hadn't expected. Men who threw things at women's feet generally didn't expect the woman to make immediate eye contact afterward. "1 meal," she said. "Let me cook 1 meal. If your men hate it, I'll leave. I won't ask for anything. Not a cent. Not a bed. I'll just go." Silas opened his mouth. "That's an offer you don't lose anything on," she added, before he could say whatever he was going to say. "Unless you're worried about something." That landed. She'd calculated it would men like Silas Crow were very sensitive to implications about their confidence, and she delivered it flatly enough that he couldn't quite accuse her of an insult. He was still deciding what to say when the door at the far end of the yard opened and Gideon Hale walked out. She sized him up the same way he was sizing her up, which was a habit she'd developed over years of arriving in places where she needed to read the room quickly. Gideon Hale was somewhere in his late 40s, lean in the way that men who work hard and sleep poorly tend to be lean, with a face that had been weathered into something that might have been handsome once and was now just reliable looking. He moved without hurry. He took in Silas's expression, the laughing hands, and Evelyn standing in the middle of the yard with a tin ladle like she'd already made herself at home, and his face gave nothing away. "Who's this?" he said. "Says she wants to cook," Silas said. His tone made it a joke. Gideon looked at Evelyn, not the way Silas had looked at her, not the quick calculation and the dismissal. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he hasn't decided about yet. "Cook professionally," he said. "My father ran a way station outside of Abilene for 14 years. I cooked for him from the time I was 12. Travelers, trail hands, the occasional family going west busy seasons, we'd feed 40 people a day out of one kitchen." She paused. "I know how to cook for working men. I know how to stretch a budget. I know what it takes to keep a crew fed through bad conditions." Gideon said nothing. "She walked in here looking like that," Silas said, gesturing at her in a way that was meant to communicate all of this, the dust and the weight and the worn satchel and everything else. "Supposed to trust her with the kitchen?" "One meal," Evelyn said again, keeping her eyes on Gideon. "If your men don't eat it, or they don't want me back, I leave. You lose nothing except whatever food I use." Something shifted slightly in Gideon's expression, not warmth exactly, but the absence of active resistance. "Show her the cookhouse," he said. Silas looked at him like he'd suggested something obscene. "Gideon, show her the cookhouse, Silas." The cookhouse was a disaster. She stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself take it in without reacting, because reacting in front of Silas Crow would give him something, and she wasn't prepared to give him anything yet. The stove needed cleaning. The floor needed more than cleaning. There were tin pans stacked in a way that suggested the previous cook had either been supremely disorganized or had left in a genuine hurry. The work table had a crack down the middle that had been addressed by someone hammering a piece of scrap wood underneath it, which kept it from wobbling but created a ridge down the center that would make rolling anything a challenge. She went to the larder. Silas stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her the way a man watches something he expects to fail. The larder had a sack of flour that was 3/4 full, but smelled like it had been stored somewhere damp at some point, which meant she'd need to check it carefully. Salt pork, the kind that had been preserved too long, and would need considerable soaking to be edible. Dried beans, which was fine, she could work with beans. String of onions, most of which had gone soft, but 4 or 5 were still firm. Lard, salt. A tin of something that turned out to be molasses, which she hadn't expected and which quietly reorganized several of her plans. "That's what you've got," Silas said. "You can work with that. Go ahead and try." She looked at the onions. She looked at the beans. She looked at the salt pork and thought about how long it would need to soak and how much time she actually had before supper. "How many men?" She said 20. "Tonight." She pulled her sleeves up. What she made that evening was not elegant. Clear-eyed enough about her own work to know that. She'd been cooking out of necessity for too long to confuse what she produced under difficult conditions with what she could produce when properly supplied, well-rested, and working in a kitchen that hadn't been neglected for 2 weeks. The beans took the longest. She had to get them going first, managing the heat carefully, adjusting twice when the stove ran uneven. The salt pork she soaked for as long as she could afford to, and then prepared it simply, because overcomplicating salt pork that hasn't soaked long enough just makes the problem worse. The onions she caramelized low and slow in the lard, and that was where the molasses came in just enough, added near the end, to take the bitterness out and give the whole thing a depth that had no business being there, given what she'd started with. She made cornbread from the flour. She checked it twice before she was satisfied it was edible. The damp smell hadn't transferred into anything she could taste, which meant the flour had aired out enough. It wasn't the best cornbread she'd ever made. It was serviceable. Sometimes serviceable is enough. Caleb Mercer showed up approximately 45 minutes before supper. He was 17, she found out later, though he could have passed for younger, one of those boys whose face hasn't yet committed to the adult version of itself, still caught somewhere between the angles of childhood and the heavier lines of grown men. He'd been sent, she suspected, by someone who wanted to check on her progress, without being seen to check on her progress. He stood in the cookhouse doorway with his hat in his hand and said, "You need any help?" She looked at him. He didn't have the mocking quality of the other men. There was just an honest curiosity in his face. The way young people sometimes look at something that's different from what they expected. "You know how to tend a fire without being told twice?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Then yes," she said, "I need help." He turned out to be useful, which was not something she'd fully anticipated. Kept the fire even. He carried things without dropping them. When she told him to watch the beans and call her if they started to stick, he watched the beans. And when they started to stick, he called her immediately, rather than waiting to see if it resolved itself, which was the decision that separated a good kitchen helper from a useless one. When the men came in for supper, she watched them the way she always watched new groups of men sitting down to eat, for the first time the way they arranged themselves. Who sat where, who looked at the food first, and who looked around the table first, who was the loudest, and who was the most dangerous. The loud ones were rarely the ones you had to watch. Quiet ones, the ones who sat down without ceremony and looked at the food like they were deciding something, those were the ones whose opinions actually mattered. Silas sat at the far end of the table. He hadn't looked at her once since she'd entered the cookhouse. The man with the missing tooth, she'd learned his name, was Harlan Pike, sat third from the left and looked at the bowl in front of him with an expression of profound skepticism. She stood near the stove and waited. The first sign was the silence, not a polite silence, not the silence of men being tolerant because the food was passable and they were hungry enough. The silence that fell over the dining room. Approximately 3 minutes after the men started eating was the silence of people who have been surprised. The silence of recalibration. Harlan Pike, who had been prepared to be amused, was not laughing. The man beside him, she didn't know his name yet, had stopped talking mid-sentence and was looking down at his bowl with a faintly confused expression, like he was trying to figure out how beans and salt pork had become this. The molasses. It was the molasses that did it. She'd learned that from her father that one unexpected element, used correctly, can make everything around it taste intentional. Onions carried it. The pork had cooked long enough that it had given up its salt into the beans rather than dominating them. It was a simple meal. It was not a magical meal, but it was the meal you ate and then thought about later, which was the actual standard she cooked to. Gideon sat at the head of the table. She watched him eat without being obvious about watching him, the way she'd watched her father, watch his customers, the crucial customers, the ones whose second order meant you kept the lights on another month. He ate without theatrics. He ate without looking up, cleaned the bowl. Then he looked over at Silas. Silas was eating. He didn't look happy about it, but he was eating, and his bowl was half empty, and his expression had shifted from contempt into something more complicated that he was working to keep off his face. After supper, after the men had drifted back toward the bunkhouse in twos and threes, quieter than they'd arrived, full in a way that had settled them, Gideon came to the cookhouse door. Evelyn was washing the pots. Caleb was stacking the clean ones, taking more care with it than was strictly necessary, which she appreciated. "There's a storage room off the back," Gideon said. "Nothing in it but old rope and a busted saddle. We'll move that out tonight." Kept washing. "You'll need to be up before dawn," he said. "I know," she said. He stood there for a moment, and she thought he might say something else, something acknowledging what had just happened, or what she'd done with his sorry larder, or maybe even something about the ladle in the yard. He didn't. He was not that kind of man. "Wages are $12 a month," he said. "Same as the last cook." "That's fine," she said. He left. She finished washing the pot she was working on, set it aside, and let herself breathe, for the first time in what felt like 4 days. Caleb, stacking pots with that unnecessary care, didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That was the best thing I've eaten since January." "January was 6 months ago," she said. He said, like that settled something important. She slept that night on a cot in the storage room, with old rope smell and Wyoming dust for company, and she slept the way she hadn't slept in weeks completely, without any part of her brain staying on watch. The fear that had been living in her chest since Daniel died, since the creditors came, since the house that was supposed to be hers turned out to have debt attached to it that she hadn't known about. That fear was still there, somewhere. But it was quieter. She'd made it through dinner. She had a bed. She had $12 a month coming. She could build from $12. She'd built from less. In the morning she was up an hour before dawn, starting the fire in the cookhouse stove, before the sky had done anything more than lighten slightly at the edges. She'd taken a full inventory the night before. After Gideon left, she knew exactly what she had, what she needed, and what she could produce from the gap between those two things for approximately how long before the next supply wagon became critical. She was making biscuits when Caleb appeared in the doorway at first light. He looked surprised to find her already there, the stove already going, the biscuits already in progress. "You want help?" he said. "Close the door," she said. "You're letting the heat out." He came in and closed the door. That was, she thought later, the beginning of it. Not the ladle in the yard, not the first supper, not Gideon's $12 a month. The beginning of it was Caleb closing the door and the cookhouse smelling like biscuits at first light. And the days organizing itself around the fire the same way days had organized themselves at her father's way station, which was the only place she'd ever felt fully competent at being alive. She taught Caleb to make biscuits that morning, not by explaining the recipe. She handed it to him and told him to follow it. Taught him by watching what he did and telling him what he was doing wrong and why, which was harder to receive than just following instructions, but produced a person who actually understood what they were doing, rather than a person who could reproduce a result in optimal conditions and nothing else. "You're pressing too hard," she said. "The dough doesn't need to be punished. You're making biscuits, not settling a dispute." He looked up at her with an expression caught between embarrassed and amused. "Like this," he said, adjusting. "Better. Don't fold it again after this. Let it be what it is." He looked at the dough. "How do you know when you've worked it enough?" "You'll know," she said. "After you've made them badly, 15 or 20 times, you'll know." That's not a very encouraging answer. "It's an accurate one," she said. The men came in for breakfast and ate without the same stunned silence as the night before. You can't surprise people twice with the same trick. And she hadn't tried. Breakfast was practical. Biscuits, salt pork, coffee that was strong enough to actually function as coffee. Men who work physical jobs at dawn need food that does what food is supposed to do. She wasn't performing this morning. She was just feeding them. But Harlan Pike, who had looked at his bowl with skepticism the night before, paused on his way out and said, without looking at her directly, "Coffee's good." It was not an elaborate compliment. It was not by any measure an emotional moment. But Harlan Pike had the quality of a man who did not say things he didn't mean, which she'd identified the previous evening. And a man who doesn't say things he doesn't mean, saying that the coffee was good, meant that the coffee was good, and he was acknowledging it, which was more than she'd expected from him on the second day. "Thank you," she said. He left. Silas had not been at breakfast. She noticed it, but didn't ask. Ranch politics were not something she needed to wade into before she'd been there a week. She had enough to do without adding that layer. But she noticed that several of the men glanced toward the far end of the table during breakfast, and glanced away, and nobody explained why that seat was empty. Spent the morning reorganizing the larder. This was not a small project. Previous cook had apparently operated on a system that was entirely internal. The organization of the larder made sense to no one but him, which meant it made sense to no one currently alive who could explain it. She pulled everything out, checked everything for spoilage, established a system based on what she'd used at the way station, things used daily in the front and accessible at arm height, things used weekly behind them, reserves in back. She labeled the containers in a plain hand, not fancy, just legible, because the point was utility. She was in the middle of this when she saw the boy. She almost missed him. He was positioned with some skill pressed against the fence on the far side of the yard, partially behind the post, in a spot where the angle from the cookhouse window didn't quite catch him, unless you were looking. He was watching the cookhouse door. He looked about 12. He was thin in the way that children are thin when they haven't been eating properly, not the thin of a growing boy, but the thin of a growing boy who hasn't had enough to grow on. She watched him for a moment without going to the window. Then she cut a thick slice of the cornbread she'd made for the midday meal, wrapped it in a piece of cloth, and walked out the back of the cookhouse to where the fence met the far side of the yard. Startled when he saw her coming. For a second she thought he was going to run. He had that look, the look of a child who's been chased off before and has developed a reflex for it. "I'm not coming to run you off," she said, stopping about 10 feet from him. She held out the cornbread. "I saw you watching the kitchen." He looked at the cornbread. He looked at her. She set it on the top rail of the fence and stepped back. He came forward slowly, watching her the whole time, and took it. "What's your name?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. He was eating the cornbread with the focused urgency of someone who'd learned not to stop eating until the food was gone, in case it was taken back. "Nolan," he said finally through a mouthful. "Where do you live, Nolan?" He gestured vaguely. Somewhere east of the ranch, she gathered. Not far, maybe. Or maybe what felt like not far to a 12-year-old who'd learned to cover ground. "Is your family around?" she said. He ate the last of the cornbread and looked at the cloth it had been wrapped in. "My ma," he said. "My pa's gone." She nodded. She didn't ask gone how or gone where, because those were usually questions that didn't have answers that made things better. "You come back tomorrow if you're hungry," she said. "Come to the back door." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen on grown men in difficult circumstances, the expression of someone deciding whether trust is something they can afford. "They'll chase me off," he said. "Not from the back door," she said. "Not if I'm the one who opened it." Silas appeared the next morning. He came into the cookhouse before breakfast. While she was in the middle of managing 3 things simultaneously: the stove, the biscuits, and a conversation with Caleb about why you salt the water before you put the grain in rather than after. He walked in like he owned the room, which she suspected he had, in some functional sense, before she arrived. He looked around the larder. He looked at the reorganized shelves. "Who gave you the authority to rearrange all this?" he said. "It needed to be rearranged," she said. She didn't look up from the stove. "Previous cook had a system." "The previous cook is gone," she said. "This is mine now." The word mine landed harder than she'd intended. She felt Caleb go very still at the work table. Silas stepped closer. He was taller than she'd registered in the yard, the kind of tall that men use, consciously or not, to make a physical argument out of a conversation. "You're going to want to be careful," he said quietly, "about how you talk about what belongs to who around here." Turned from the stove and looked at him directly. "I'm cooking for 20 men," she said. "I'm going to need to know what's in that larder, and where it is, and how much of it there is at any given time. If that arrangement creates a problem, I'd like to hear what the problem is specifically." He held the look for a moment. Men like Silas Crow were not accustomed to women who held the look. He left without saying what the problem was specifically. Caleb released a breath. "He's going to be trouble," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "Pass me the salt." Ply order went wrong at the end of the 2nd week. She'd submitted it carefully. She'd spent an hour on it, which was longer than it probably needed, but she was still learning what the ranch went through in a week and wanted to be sure before she committed to numbers. Flour, cornmeal, salt, dried beans, lard, coffee, sugar, salt pork. Simple things. Everything written out clearly. What arrived was wrong. The flour was half what she'd ordered. The coffee was a quarter. In their place, beans 3 times what she'd asked for, and an additional barrel of salt that she had no immediate use for. She stood in the yard looking at the delivery and ran through the possibilities. Misread order, supply wagon error, substitution because something was unavailable. Then she looked at the beans and thought about the way Silas had stood in the cookhouse looking at her reorganized shelves, and she understood. She went to Gideon. She didn't make accusations. She laid out what she'd ordered and what had arrived and said that she wanted to understand how the discrepancy happened before she adjusted her plans around it. Because if there was a supply problem, she needed to account for it going forward. Gideon asked questions. Quiet questions. The kind that moved slowly and covered ground without seeming to rush. That evening she heard raised voices from somewhere near the bunkhouse. Gideon's voice, lower and harder than she'd heard it before, and Silas's voice, defensive and tight. Couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. The following week, her supply order arrived exactly as submitted. Nobody explained what had changed. Nobody apologized. Silas avoided the cookhouse for 3 days, which was, she had come to understand, his version of a concession. She took the concession and kept cooking. Caleb, watching all of this from the safe position of someone who was young enough to observe without being required to take sides, came into the cookhouse one afternoon while she was working on the next week's menu and said, "He hates you." "Yes," she said, not looking up. "Why aren't you scared of him?" Thought about that. It was a genuine question from a 17-year-old who was still in the process of learning which things were worth being scared of. "I've been scared," she said. "I spent 2 days on a broken road in August without enough water being scared. I arrived in that yard with $2 and nowhere to sleep being scared." She put down the pencil. "Silas Crow is a problem. He's not the kind of problem that ends me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How do you know the difference?" he said. "Experience," she said, "and some of it you just have to guess." She picked up the pencil again. Now hand me that inventory list. I need to figure out what we're doing with 3 times more beans than any reasonable cook would ever need. Caleb laughed a real one, surprised out of him, and handed her the list. Outside, the Wyoming summer pressed down on Blackridge Ranch, and the men worked, and the cattle moved, and the cookhouse fire burned steady all day, the way it had burned every day since she arrived. The woman they'd laughed at in the yard was, quietly, and without announcement, making herself indispensable. And Silas Crow, standing somewhere near the fence line, watching the cookhouse window, was beginning to understand that the thing he'd dismissed as weakness was not weakness at all. He just didn't know yet what to do about that. The beans were still a problem. 3 times the normal quantity sat in sacks along the back wall of the larder, and Evelyn looked at them every morning the way you look at a relative who's shown up uninvited and shown no signs of leaving. She'd worked beans into the rotation more heavily than she'd planned bean soup, beans alongside the salt pork, beans in a stew stretched with dried onion, and the last of the summer squash that Caleb had found, going soft behind the bunkhouse. The men hadn't complained, which she took as a sign that they were either genuinely satisfied or had learned, in the 3 weeks since her arrival, that complaining about the food was not a productive use of anyone's time. She suspected it was some of both. The morning after Gideon's confrontation with Silas, the one she'd heard through the bunkhouse wall, without being able to make out the words, Silas had come to breakfast, and sat in his usual seat and said nothing. He ate. He drank his coffee. He left. The hands around him had the careful, slightly over-casual quality of men who had witnessed something and decided among themselves not to reference it. Evelyn cooked the eggs she'd traded for with a past farm woman and said nothing either. She watched. She'd been watching since the first morning, cataloging things the way her father had taught her to catalog the travelers who came through his way station, not from nosiness, but from necessity. You learned people's habits so you could serve them correctly. You learned who needed the coffee black and who needed it cut with something sweet. You learned who was going to be difficult before they opened their mouth, because difficult people had tells, small behavioral flags that announced them if you were paying attention. Silas Crow's tell was that he reorganized things. She noticed it after the supply order incident. Small things: a tool moved from where she'd left it, a tin shifted on a shelf, the stack of firewood beside the cookhouse door rearranged from the way she'd had it. None of it consequential, all of it deliberate. It was the behavior of a man who needed to establish, in small daily ways, that he still had authority over the space, even when the larger authority had been removed from him. She understood it. She didn't like it, but she understood it. She started leaving things in the same place twice in a row, then moving them deliberately on the 3rd day, not to confuse him, but to let him know she'd noticed. It was a small exchange conducted entirely without words, and she doubted anyone else at Blackridge Ranch was even aware it was happening. Caleb noticed, though. "You moved the salt again," he said one morning, watching her shift it back to the position it had been 2 days ago. "Someone keeps putting it in the wrong place," she said. Caleb looked at the salt. He looked at her. He was 17 and not stupid. "Right," he said, and went back to the biscuits. By the end of the 3rd week, she had the crew's rhythms memorized. Harlan Pike ate more than anyone else and ate faster, which meant he was always slightly at risk of finishing before the men around him and sitting with an empty bowl, which made him irritable in a low-grade way that occasionally surfaced as sharpness toward whoever was sitting nearest. She started plating his servings about 15% larger, quietly, without calling attention to it. He never mentioned it. His sharpness at the table declined. Tom Briggs, who sat second from the right, and had the sunburned look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors without thinking much about it, had a bad back. She'd figured this out by watching the way he lowered himself into his chair, careful, deliberate, trying not to show that it cost him. He also, she noticed, ate less on the days when the work had been particularly hard, which was backwards from what his body needed, but was consistent with the way pain tends to suppress appetite at the exact moment nutrition matters most. She started adding more fat to his portions on the heavy work days, not obvious about it, just more lard in the beans, an extra piece of salt pork because fat held longer in the body than grain, and he needed the sustained fuel. Tom Briggs never said a word about his back. He also started finishing his bowl on the hard work days, which had not happened before. She did not consider any of this extraordinary. It was what cooking for working people actually required, not just the ability to combine ingredients into something edible, but the ongoing study of who you were feeding and what they needed from the food. Her father had called it listening with your eyes. She'd always thought that was slightly more poetic than the reality warranted, but the principle was sound. Caleb was learning it too, though he didn't realize that's what he was learning. "Why are we adding extra lard to Briggs's bowl?" he asked one afternoon, watching her prepare the evening plates. "'Cause he needs it," she said. "He's not going to notice." "I know," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then why bother? She looked at him. He was a good question asker, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He didn't ask questions to be difficult. He asked because he genuinely wanted to understand. "Because the point isn't whether he notices," she said. "Point is whether it helps." Caleb thought about that while he stirred the pot. "That seems like a lot of work for something nobody sees," he said finally. "Most of the important work is like that," she said. The ankle happened on a Thursday. She was in the cookhouse starting the noon meal when she heard the commotion in the yard, not the usual noise of men working, but the particular quality of noise that means someone has gotten hurt. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Harlan Pike was being half carried, half walked by two of the younger hands, his face set in the specific expression of a man refusing to show pain in front of people. His left boot was dragging. The other men were clustered at a respectful distance, which meant it wasn't life-threatening, but it also wasn't nothing. She looked at his boot. She looked at the angle of his foot. "Bring him in here," she said. Everybody stopped, including the two men holding Harlan. "Ma'am?" one of them said. "There's a chair in the cookhouse. Bring him in." There was a brief pause during which several of the watching men seemed to be calculating whether this was a reasonable suggestion or a completely unreasonable one. Harlan Pike settled the question by saying, through his teeth, "Just do it," and they carried him in. She had him sit with his foot elevated on an overturned crate. She pulled off his boot carefully. He made one short, controlled sound when the heel came free and assessed the ankle. Swollen. Not broken, she thought, though she'd been wrong before and said so clearly. Badly twisted, probably caught in something in the yard. Kind of injury that men on a working ranch either ignored until it became a serious problem or rested properly and recovered from in a week. She had witch hazel in the cookhouse. She had it because she'd been at enough way stations and rough kitchens to know that medical supplies and cooking supplies occupied the same practical territory when the nearest doctor was 2 hours' ride away. She had strips of cloth she could use for wrapping. She also had cold water from the morning's bucket, which was the first thing an ankle needed. "This is going to be cold," she said. "I can manage cold," Harlan said. She pressed the cold cloth against his ankle. He managed cold as promised. He didn't make a sound, just looked at the ceiling of the cookhouse with the expression of a man conducting an internal conversation about endurance. While she worked, the two young hands who'd carried him in stood just inside the door, not quite sure whether to stay or go. One of them, she thought his name was Davis. She was still learning. The younger ones kept glancing from Harlan's ankle to her face with an expression of uncertain concentration. "He's going to need to stay off this for a few days," she said, wrapping the ankle with the cloth strips. "Can't," Harlan said. "Cattle don't stop. The cattle will keep. You'll do more damage walking on this before it's had time to settle. Lady, I've worked through worse." "I know you have," she said, not looking up from the wrapping. "That's how men end up with permanently bad ankles. You work through the first injury badly, then the second one finishes it." Harlan looked down at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen there before, not quite respect, not yet, but the early stages of reassessment. "Gideon's not going to like losing a hand for 3 days, he said. "I'll speak to Gideon," she said. "You stay off it." She finished wrapping the ankle, re-elevated it on the crate, and went back to the stove, because the noon meal didn't stop for sprained ankles. Behind her, Harlan Pike sat in the cookhouse chair with his foot up and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said thank you. It came out roughly, like a word he wasn't in the habit of using, and didn't quite know how to deliver without it feeling strange. "Don't mention it," she said, and she meant it practically. She genuinely didn't want it mentioned, because drawing attention to small kindnesses created obligations and expectations she didn't have time to manage. She brought Gideon his midday coffee and told him about Harlan's ankle and what she'd done and what she thought about it medically, which was appropriately hedged because she wasn't a doctor and she knew it. Gideon listened. He asked whether she thought 3 days was necessary or whether 2 might do. 3, she said. 2 if he absolutely can't be spared. 3 is better. Gideon nodded once, which she had come to understand was the Gideon Hale version of a firm agreement. She went back to the cookhouse. That evening, Harlan Pike ate dinner in the cookhouse, rather than the dining room she'd arranged a plate for him, without making a ceremony of it, brought it over to where he was still sitting with his foot up, not because she thought he couldn't manage the walk to the dining room, but because the dining room chair would be worse for his ankle than the cookhouse crate. He ate without saying much. She worked around him. At some point she put a second piece of cornbread on his plate, without asking. He didn't comment on it, but he ate it. Nolan came every morning now. Not always at the same time. He had the irregular schedule of a child without much structure, which told her things about his home situation she filed away without examining too closely. She left food for him at the back of the cookhouse, usually something wrapped in cloth, cornbread, a piece of cold salt pork, biscuits when she had extra. He'd started staying longer, which she also noticed. The first few times he'd grabbed the food and retreated immediately, watching her from a distance with that calculating expression. Now he sometimes sat on the fence rail and ate while she worked with the back door open, and occasionally, not often, but occasionally he asked questions. "Why do you cut the lard in before you add the liquid?" he said one morning, watching her work the biscuit dough. "Because if you add the liquid first, the lard coats the flour differently," she said. "You get a different texture, less flaky." He thought about this with the seriousness that children bring to information they've actually decided to care about. "Does it matter?" he said. "Matters to the biscuit," she said. He almost smiled at that. She didn't push it. With children who'd been skittish, you didn't push. You just kept the door open and let them come in at their own pace. Silas found him on the fence rail on the fourth morning. She heard Silas's voice from the yard before she saw what was happening, that specific quality of adult authority being applied to a child. The kind of voice that was designed to make you feel small and stupid simultaneously. "Get off that fence. I've told you twice already. You don't belong here." She was at the back door in 4 steps. Nolan had gotten off the fence. He was standing in the dirt with his half-eaten cornbread in his hand, and the expression of a child who has learned from experience that adults with that tone of voice usually mean what they say. "He's here at my invitation," Evelyn said. Silas turned to look at her. The annoyance on his face shifted into something more calculated. "Ranch isn't a charity house," he said. It was the same phrase he'd used the first day, she noticed. It was apparently the phrase he reached for when he wanted to establish the terms of a situation quickly. "He's not costing the ranch anything," she said. "What I set out for him comes out of my portion." This was true. She'd been setting aside a portion of her own food allocation since the second day, reducing her own portion slightly to cover Nolan's. She hadn't told anyone this, not because she was hiding it, but because it wasn't anyone's business. Silas looked at her. He looked at Nolan, who was looking at the ground. "Catch him inside the fence line again. I'm running him off myself," Silas said. "Then I'll take it to Gideon," Evelyn said. The words came out before she'd fully decided to say them. It was not characteristic of her. She was generally more deliberate. But there was something about Nolan, standing in the dirt with his cornbread and his eyes on the ground, that bypassed the deliberate part of her and went straight to something older and less patient. Silas held the look for a moment. Then he walked away. Nolan looked up at her. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "He'll just be worse." "Maybe," she said. "Come around back." She went inside and he came around to the back door, which put him out of sight from the main yard. She gave him the rest of the cornbread she'd wrapped for him and an additional biscuit, because he was in 12 and had just been talked to like he was vermin, and she figured the extra biscuit was warranted. She did go to Gideon that evening. She laid it out plainly. The boy was hungry. The boy was going to keep coming to the back door regardless of what Sisa said, and she wanted it established that this was permitted rather than having it be a recurring confrontation. Gideon listened. "How old is the boy?" he said. 12, I think. Father is gone. He and his mother are somewhere east of the property." Gideon was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking something through. "He can come to the back," Gideon said. "Keep it out of Silas's yard. That's all I'm asking," she said. She left. Behind her, she heard Gideon set the coffee cup down with a deliberateness that suggested he wasn't finished thinking about whatever he was thinking about. She didn't press it. What she hadn't anticipated was how much Caleb and Nolan would take to each other. It happened gradually, the way most things at Blackridge happened, not announced, not orchestrated, just present one day when it hadn't been the day before. Caleb started timing his breaks to coincide with when Nolan appeared at the back fence. Come outside with something, a piece of bread, a cup of water, and lean against the fence post, and talk to the boy with an ease she hadn't expected from him. Caleb was not by nature a particularly social creature. He was observant, and he was capable, and he was decent, but he spent most of his energy in the cookhouse rather than building relationships in the yard. With Nolan, though, he was different. Patient in a way he wasn't quite patient with himself. He answered questions without making them feel stupid. He let the boy watch him work without hovering. She noticed this and said nothing about it, because it was not the kind of thing that benefited from being talked about. One afternoon, she came out to find Caleb teaching Nolan the proper way to hold a knife while cutting not at the cookhouse work table, but at the fence rail, with a piece of bread and a pocket knife, which was not exactly ideal instruction conditions, but was clearly working. Nolan's face had the focused, quiet expression of a child, learning something he'd decided actually mattered to him. She watched them for a moment. Then she went back inside and adjusted the supper portions to account for the fact that Nolan would probably be eating with them tonight if she timed the invitation correctly. Timed it correctly. He ate 3 servings of beans and looked embarrassed about it afterward, and Caleb told him without looking up from his own bowl that there was no shame in being hungry, and that the beans were particularly good today anyway, which made Nolan eat the 4th spoonful he'd been hesitating over, and Evelyn kept her eyes on her own plate and did not comment. The supply order manipulation was not a one-time incident. She didn't realize this until the 5th week, when her written order for cornmeal came back with the quantity halved, and the difference made up with an additional barrel of dried beans, which she was now managing with the grim determination of a woman who has been given a challenge she didn't ask for and is going to solve it anyway. She stood in the yard looking at the delivery and felt the particular cold clarity of understanding. Something she'd been hoping wasn't true. This was not a supply wagon error. This was not a miscommunication. Someone was intercepting her orders or a copy of them and making changes before they reached the supplier. The changes were careful enough to not look like sabotage at first glance. They were the kind of adjustments a distracted person might make, or a person who didn't know the kitchen's actual needs. But she knew her actual needs, and the pattern was not random. She considered going to Gideon immediately. She considered waiting. She waited because she wanted one more data point. She wanted to see if it happened again on the next order. And she wanted to see if the pattern was consistent enough that she could present it as a pattern rather than a suspicion. Gideon Hale was a man who responded to evidence. She'd observed this in the way he ran the ranch. He didn't move on impressions. He moved on things he could look at and verify. She submitted the next order with 2 copies, keeping one for herself, documenting the date and the quantities precisely. When the delivery came in, she compared it to her copy. Flour ordered 40 pounds, received 22. Cornmeal ordered 20 pounds, received 10. Beans ordered 10 pounds, received 30. Salt ordered 5 pounds, received 15. She folded her copy carefully and put it in the small, locked box she kept under her cot. She'd had the box for years, carried it through the move after Daniel died, and the creditors came, and the house wasn't hers anymore. It had held more important things than supply order copies. It would hold these too. Then she went to Gideon. She laid the 2 copies on his desk, the order she'd submitted, and the delivery record. She said nothing. She let him read them. Gideon's face did not change expression. That was the thing about him. His face was a poor indicator of what was happening internally, which made him difficult to read, and probably made him an effective rancher in a territory where showing your hand at the wrong moment had real consequences. He read both documents. He set them down. "I'll look into this," he said. "I'd appreciate it," she said. "I can work around the shortfalls. I've been doing it. But I need to know whether this is going to continue so I can plan accordingly." "It won't continue," he said. She picked up her documents, folded them, and put them back in her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said. She left. That evening she heard voices from the direction of Gideon's office, Gideon's and Silas's. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The tone of Gideon's voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something harder and less negotiable than his usual manner. And Silas's voice had the quality of a man who'd been caught and knew it and was calculating his options. The next morning, Silas did not come to breakfast. Came to lunch, ate in silence, and left without looking at anyone. The morning after that, Evelyn found the firewood beside the cookhouse door, arranged the way she had put it, exactly as she had put it, without any of the small rearrangements she'd been tracking. She stood looking at the firewood for a moment. Then she went inside and started the fire. The shift, when it came, was not dramatic. She had expected something, a confrontation, maybe, or an explicit acknowledgement from Silas that the dynamic between them had changed. What happened instead was quieter and stranger and in some ways more final. Silas simply began to recede. He was present at meals. He did his work. But the small daily adversarial rituals, the rearranged supplies, the loaded comments at the table, the way he positioned himself in any shared space to suggest ownership, those things stopped. He looked, when she caught his face in an unguarded moment, like a man who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work. She thought about this sometimes in the quiet hour before dawn when she was starting the fire and the rest of the ranch was still dark. She had not set out to defeat Silas Crow. She had set out to cook and to keep her position and to survive the particular challenge of being a woman in a place that had been organized around the assumption that women were not present. The conflict with Silas had been a feature of that landscape, not the goal. But she understood, in the way you understand things when you have time and quiet and no one is watching, that something in him had broken off. Not the way a man breaks when he loses a fight that had a different quality, the quality of anger redirected. It's more like the way something breaks when it has been holding tension for too long, and the tension finally releases. He looked lighter in a strange way, less armored. She did not know what Gideon had said to him. She did not ask. Harlan Pike's ankle healed in 4 days, which was faster than she'd predicted, and pleased him considerably. On the 5th day, when he was back on full work, he came into the cookhouse before breakfast and set a small paper-wrapped parcel on the work table without explanation. She looked at it. "What's this?" she said. "Dried apple from a family 3 miles east," he said. "They gave me a sack for helping with a fence repair last month. Figured you could do something with it." She opened the parcel. The dried apple was good, properly dried, not overdone, with enough moisture left that it would reconstitute well. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," he said, which was, she recognized, a deliberate echo of what she'd said to him when she'd wrapped his ankle, and which was therefore as close to a joke as Harlan Pike was likely to get. She almost smiled. She put the dried apple in the larder, in the front row where she could see it, and began planning what to make with it when the time was right. September arrived the way Wyoming Septembers do, not gradually but suddenly, a change in the quality of the light before the temperature had quite caught up to what the light was promising. The mornings got cold faster than she'd expected. The men started wearing their heavier coats earlier, which told her something about how they anticipated the coming months, and what she was observing in the shift from late summer to early fall told her something too. She started paying attention to the root cellar. Blackridge's root cellar was adequate, but poorly used. There were things in it from the spring that should have been dealt with months ago, and hadn't been, which had led to some lost vegetables that had gone past saving, a small barrel of something she couldn't identify anymore that she had removed and disposed of without comment. Structure itself was solid, well built, deep enough to maintain a consistent temperature through a Wyoming winter if properly managed. She began a list. What would need to be preserved? Could be dried? What needed to be put up in crocks? How much of each thing Blackridge Ranch required to feed 20 men for varying lengths of time? 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 10 weeks, at what level of adequacy? She did not tell anyone she was making this list. It was, at this stage, purely precautionary. She had no specific information about what the coming winter would bring, and no particular reason to think it would be worse than an ordinary Wyoming winter. But she had grown up in a way station where travelers arrived without enough of everything, and had learned from those experiences that adequate preparation was invisible. You never saw it working. You only saw the results of its absence. Her father had told her once that the best preparedness was the kind nobody ever had to know about. She thought about that while she updated her list at the end of each day, sitting at the cookhouse work table after the supper dishes were done, and the fire had settled to coals, and Caleb had gone to the bunkhouse. Caleb had started sleeping in the bunkhouse with the other hands, about 2 weeks after her arrival, which she'd suggested gently when she noticed that his cot in the corner of the cookhouse was keeping him half awake during early morning preparation. He'd been resistant at first. She suspected he'd been sleeping in the cookhouse because he was trying to be useful, which was a Caleb thing to do, but he'd agreed eventually, and now he arrived in the mornings at the hour she expected him, rested and ready, which was better for everyone. She wrote, dried beans current supply adequate through December, if supplemented. Cured meat insufficient for winter, need to address before first freeze. Root vegetables begin preservation this week, cannot wait. She added, dried apple Harlan's parcel, use carefully. She added one more line, which she stared at for a moment before writing. Nolan assess family food situation before winter. Do not wait. She folded the list and put it with the supply records in her locked box. Outside, the Wyoming night had gone completely cold, the way it did in September once the sun went down fast and absolute, without the softening that summer nights had. The fire in the stove had burned to almost nothing. She banked what was left carefully, so the morning start would be easier. She thought about the winter. She thought about 20 men who were not thinking about the winter, who were thinking about cattle and wages and the daily work that consumed all available attention when you were physically engaged in it hour after hour. She did not resent them for it. That was the nature of physical labor. It took everything you had and left little room for the kind of abstract planning that depended on standing still long enough to look ahead. That was what she was for. Not just the food, not just the kitchen. Standing still and the looking ahead. She blew out the lamp and went to her room, which still smelled faintly of old rope if the weather had been dry, and which was entirely and completely hers in a way that very little had been hers for a very long time. She slept. In the morning, the fire would need lighting before anyone else was awake, and there would be 20 men to feed, and the root cellar needed proper assessment, and Nolan would appear at the back fence at some point before noon, and Caleb would arrive with his boots tied and ask what needed doing. She had learned over the years that this was enough. Not comfortable, not easy, not the life she'd imagined for herself when she was young, and imagining was something she did freely. But enough solid, purposeful, daily enough, the kind of enough that held a person upright when the alternative was falling down. She had not fallen down yet. She did not intend to start now. The root cellar took 3 days to properly assess and another week to bring into the condition she needed it to be in. She did most of the work herself, which was not ideal. The cellar steps were narrow, and the ceiling was low and moving in and out of it repeatedly with her body, and the heat she carried from years of hard living was exhausting in a way she didn't mention to anyone. Caleb helped when she let him, which was for the heavy lifting and the carrying of the larger crocks. The organization itself she kept to herself, because the system in her head was specific, and she didn't have the patience to explain it while simultaneously executing it. The previous cook had used the cellar the way a man uses a drawer he doesn't want to deal with. Things went in, things came out, and the logic connecting those two events was entirely situational. She found a crock of pickled something in the far back corner that she couldn't date and didn't trust, and removed without ceremony. Found potatoes that were still good, which surprised her, and onions that were mostly gone, which did not. There were empty crocks that had been there long enough to collect a fine layer of dust along the interior lip, and she washed those and set them to dry in the thin autumn sun and thought about what she needed to fill them with before the ground froze. The list she'd been building since early September had gotten longer. Cured meat. She'd spoken to Gideon about this in the second week of September, presenting the numbers plainly how many pounds of preserved meat they'd need to carry 20 men through a bad winter, what the current supply looked like against that figure, what she thought needed to happen before the first hard freeze. Gideon had listened. He'd authorized the purchase of 2 additional hogs from a farm 12 miles south, which were slaughtered and cured over 4 days, that left the cookhouse smelling of smoke and salt in a way that clung to everything for a week afterward. The men complained about the smell. Evelyn did not acknowledge the complaints. Caleb, who had helped with the curing and emerged from the process with a new understanding of exactly how much work it involved, told the complaining men that if they preferred to eat wind in January, they were welcome to it, which made several of them laugh and effectively ended the discussion. She preserved what the land and the season would give her. A neighboring farm had an excess of winter squash they were glad to sell cheaply, and she bought as much as she could transport in 2 wagon loads. She dried apples her own small store, and Harlan's parcel and a larger purchase from a farm woman who came through with a wagon of late-season goods, slicing them thin and stringing them near the stove where heat would take the moisture out without cooking them. Put up beans in crocks with salt. She rendered lard until the cookhouse smelled like something between a kitchen and a factory, and her arms ached from the work. She did not explain what she was doing to the hands. They noticed because 20 men living in a contained space notice most things that are happening around them, but the noticing didn't translate into understanding. Caught Davis the young one, the one who'd stood uncertain in the cookhouse doorway when Harlan's ankle was being wrapped, watching her string apples with an expression that suggested he was trying to work out whether this was normal cook behavior or something else. "You always put up this much," he said. "When it's needed," she said. "Is it needed?" She looked at him. He was maybe 19, she thought. with the open face of someone who hadn't yet learned to compose his expression around people he wasn't sure about. "Yes," she said. He seemed to accept this without further interrogation, which was a quality she was coming to appreciate in Davis. He asked his question, got his answer, and moved on without making a production of either. Harlan, who asked fewer questions but observed more carefully, said nothing about the preservation work. He simply, one afternoon, brought her a second parcel of dried apple from the same farm family 3 miles east, set it on the work table, and left. She put it with the rest. Silas came to her in the second week of October. She was at the work table doing the weekly inventory, which she did every Tuesday afternoon, not because she enjoyed inventory, which she did not, but because knowing exactly what she had was the only way to plan responsibly. She heard his footstep in the doorway and knew it was him. Before she looked up, she'd learned his step the way you learn the sound of weather coming, not by trying but by repetition. Stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, which was different. In all her weeks at Blackridge, she had never seen Silas Crow with his hat in his hands. She set down her pencil and waited. "I'm leaving," he said. She looked at him. His face had that same quality she'd been noticing for the past several weeks, the quality of something that had been under sustained pressure for a long time, and had finally made a decision, and the decision, whatever it was, had taken something out of him. "When?" she said. "End of the week. Told Gideon this morning." She nodded. She didn't ask why, because she thought she understood at least the surface of it. The situation at Blackridge had become untenable for him in a way that had accumulated gradually and was now simply past whatever threshold he'd set for himself. Men like Silas Crow didn't leave places easily. The leaving meant the threshold was well past. But he was still standing there, hat in hands, which meant he had more to say. She waited. "I had a brother," he said. She hadn't expected that. Kept her face still. 7 years ago. There was an accident out on the east pasture, fence repair, the kind of thing that happens 50 times without incident, and then once it doesn't. He paused. He was looking at the work table rather than at her, which she thought was easier for him. "I was the foreman. I was responsible for the crew. I should have. There were things I should have done differently. The way the work was organized that day. I knew better, and I let it go because we were behind, and Gideon needed the fence done." He stopped. "His name was Robert," he said. She sat with that for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked up at her then, and what she saw in his face was not grief exactly. The grief had been carried so long. It had changed shape into something harder and more interior, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been waiting for the right occasion to surface. "I've been hard on you," he said. It came out flat without the softening inflection that would have made it an apology. It was more like a statement of fact he was submitting for the record. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He seemed to have expected this. She'd noticed that he responded better to directness than to diplomacy, which was possibly the one thing they had in common. "It wasn't right," he said. "No," she said. "It wasn't." Another silence. The fire in the stove had settled to a steady burn, and the cookhouse was warm in a way the rest of the ranch was not. October having committed fully to the project of cooling Wyoming down. "You've done good work here," Silas said. It cost him something, she could see that. It was the most difficult sentence in the conversation. "Thank you," she said. He put his hat back on. He looked, with the hat on, more like himself, or at least more like the self she'd known since August, which was possibly not his actual self at all, but just the version he'd assembled to survive his own guilt. He left. She sat at the work table for a moment without moving. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to the inventory, because the inventory needed doing, and Silas Crow leaving didn't change what was in the larder. But she thought about Robert, his brother. She thought about the east pasture and a fence repair 7 years ago, and the weight a man carries when he's decided that what happened was his fault, and how that weight, carried long enough, turns into something corrosive that bleeds outward onto everything it touches. She thought about how long Silas had been pouring that corrosion into his job, into his authority, into the people around him, who had nothing to do with a fence on the east pasture 7 years ago. She didn't forgive him exactly. Forgiveness was a transaction that required both parties to be present for it, and she wasn't sure Silas was capable of receiving it, not yet. But she understood him, which was different from forgiving him, and also, she'd found, more useful. She finished the inventory and started planning supper. He was gone by Friday. He left early before breakfast, which meant most of the hands didn't see him go. Gideon told them at the morning meal, plainly and without elaboration, that Silas had moved on, and that the ranch would operate without a dedicated foreman through the winter, with Gideon himself taking on more of the day-to-day management. The men received this with the particular quietness of people processing something they'd been expecting for a while. Harlan Pike, who had been at Blackridge the longest of any of the hands, looked at his coffee cup for a moment and then drank up from it without saying anything, which seemed to be his contribution to the group response. Caleb looked at Evelyn from across the cookhouse. She looked back at him and then at her stove. The morning went on. What she noticed, in the days following Silas's departure, was not relief exactly. The atmosphere didn't suddenly lighten in the dramatic way that stories suggested it should, the way a room was supposed to feel different when a heavy presence left it. What she noticed instead was that certain small daily frictions simply stopped occurring, the way a low-grade sound you've gotten used to stops, and you realize only in its absence that it had been there all along. The mornings felt less guarded. The men at breakfast talked more freely. Harlan Pike, who had held himself carefully in a middle space between Silas's camp and something he didn't have a name for, relaxed his shoulders at the table in a way she hadn't seen him do before. Gideon moved differently too. He was at the cookhouse earlier in the mornings for his coffee, and he sometimes lingered a few minutes longer than strictly necessary, which she'd learned meant he was thinking about something. She didn't ask what. He'd tell her if it was relevant. One morning he lingered long enough that Caleb had gone to start on the noon prep, and it was just the two of them with the fire and the early light coming through the small window. "You've been putting a lot up," Gideon said. Not an accusation, more an observation he was offering to see what she did with it. "Yes," she said. Any particular reason? It was not quite a question. She considered her answer for a moment. She thought about the list in her locked box. She thought about the root cellar and the crocks, and the dried apples and the cured meat, and the weeks of calculation that had gone into it all. "The winter's going to be bad," she said. Gideon looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way the summer ended. How early the cold came in. The animals have been moving different. The deer are coming closer to the buildings than they usually do at this point in the season. And the last supply wagon driver told me that the mountain passes are already showing more ice than last year by this date." She paused. "It may be nothing. I could be wrong. But I'd rather have the stores and not need them than need them and not have them." Gideon was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup. "How much do you have?" he said. "Enough for 14 weeks if I'm careful," she said. "Longer if the situation requires rationing." He looked at her steadily. "You've been planning this since September," he said. "Since late August," she said. The signs were there in August. He set the cup down. "What do you need that you don't have yet?" he said. She had the answer ready, because she always had the answer ready. "Another barrel of lard, more salt, and if you can get me access to any additional root vegetables before the ground freezes, I'll take everything I can get. I'll see to it," he said. He left. She stood in the cookhouse with the fire going and the morning coming in through the window and felt something that wasn't quite certainty, but was close to it, the particular steadiness that came from having done the work, having planned as thoroughly as she could plan, having laid the groundwork for whatever the winter was going to be. She was not confident the winter would be bad. She was not confident about anything that Wyoming's weather might do. But she was confident in her stores, in her plans, in the 14 weeks of sustenance sitting in a root cellar that she had organized herself down to the last crock. That would have to be enough. The first real snow came in early November. Not the serious storm that came later, but the advance notice of it. 2 inches overnight that left the yard white and the men's boots wet from the morning walk, and the temperature dropped enough that the water barrel beside the bunkhouse developed a skim of ice by midday. The hands came in for lunch louder than usual, the way people get louder when weather reminds them of their own smallness, filling the noise with conversation to push back against it. Nolan still came, though less regularly now that the cold had made the walk from wherever he lived harder. On the days he came, Evelyn noticed he was thinner than he'd been in September, which was wrong. He should have been putting weight on, not losing it. She started packing a larger parcel for him to take home, enough for 2 or 3 days, and she did it without ceremony, just handed it to him wrapped in cloth and said that the cold made it hard to cook, and she had extra, which was only partly a lie. He looked at the parcel. He looked at her. He was 12 years old and had the eyes of someone who had already understood at 12 that charity and necessity wear each other's clothes, often enough that the distinction doesn't always matter. "Thank you," he said. "Don't mention it," she said, which was the 3rd time she'd said those exact words to someone at Blackridge, and she was starting to think it might be her philosophy accidentally surfacing as a reflex. Caleb, watching from the doorway, said nothing. Later, when Nolan had gone, Caleb said, "Is his mother okay?" "I don't know," she said. "I'm hoping the food reaches her. Should someone go out there and check?" She looked at him. He was 18 now. He'd had a birthday in October, which she'd marked with a small apple cake made from the dried stores, and which he'd been flustered by in the way young people are flustered when they realize they've been cared for. He was not 17's version of himself anymore. Something had shifted in him over the months, some slow clarification, and the person standing in her cookhouse doorway was cleaner in his intentions than the boy who'd arrived uncertain at the beginning of August. "Yes," she said. "Someone probably should." She didn't have to say anything else. He went and found Gideon. Gideon sent 2 of the hands out 3 days later with a parcel. Evelyn prepared beans, lard, dried apple, salt pork, and a note she wrote in plain language that explained how to prepare each thing. They came back and told Gideon that the woman Nolan's mother, Mara Reed, was managing, but only barely. The house was drafty. The food supply was low. She had a pride about her that had made accepting the parcel complicated, but she'd accepted it. Evelyn heard this from Caleb, who heard it from Davis, who had been one of the 2 who went. Thought about Mara Reed in a drafty house with a 12-year-old boy and a pride that complicated accepting help, and she recognized something in that portrait that she would have preferred not to recognize. She packed another parcel. She sent it out with Nolan the next day with specific instructions about the lard and how to render it carefully so it went further, and a second note about the beans, more detailed this time, and she wrote it the way her father had written things practically, without condescension, as though the reader was competent and just needed the information. She did not go herself. She thought about it and decided against it. Mara Reed had her pride, and a stranger arriving at her door, especially a stranger from the ranch that had been feeding her son, might complicate things in ways that weren't useful. The notes were better. The food was better. Let the boy carry what needed to be carried, and let the woman receive it in whatever way she needed to. There was a difference between helping and insisting on being seen to help. Her father had taught her that too, though he hadn't put it in those words. The warning came from the west. A rider came through on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, moving with the urgency of someone carrying news that couldn't wait. Stopped at Blackridge because it was the first significant ranch he'd hit on the eastern side of the range, and he told Gideon what he'd seen coming. Storm system building over the mountains that the old-timers in the valley were calling the worst they'd anticipated in a decade. He'd seen the sky from the high pass. He'd felt what the air was doing. He'd been in Wyoming long enough to know what those 2 things together meant. Stayed one night, ate supper in the dining room, and left at first light. Gideon came to the cookhouse that evening. Evelyn had already heard news traveled fast through 20 men living in a small space, and she was at her work table with the inventory open in front of her, running numbers. "The writer's report Gideon started, I heard," she said. He came to stand across from her at the table. He looked at the inventory sheet. "How are we?" he said. "Better than I expected to be at this point," she said. She turned the sheet so he could see it. 14 weeks was the estimate. The storm is as bad as he's describing, and we lose supply access entirely, which we should plan for. That's 8, maybe 10 weeks of isolation. We can feed the men adequately through that." "Adequately," Gideon said. "Not well," she said, "adequately. There's a difference. The variety will suffer. The men will get tired of what I'm serving. But nobody will go hungry." He looked at the numbers for a long time. "You plan for this," he said. Not an accusation, not quite, more like a statement being offered for her to correct if she needed to. "I planned for something like this," she said. "I didn't know it would be this specific. Most people didn't plan for anything. Most people weren't looking at the same things I was looking at," she said. He looked up from the inventory. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not the careful neutrality of a man managing a complex operation, and not the professional assessment she'd been receiving from him since the first night. Something more direct than either of those. "What do you need to do before it hits?" he said. She told him. She had the list ready. She'd been preparing it in her head since the rider arrived, and she heard what the sky looked like over the mountains. They needed to move certain stores from the root cellar into the cookhouse itself, because if the snow got heavy enough, access to the cellar could become limited. They needed to ensure the cookhouse fire could be maintained without constant trips to the woodpile. Enough wood stacked inside or in the covered space beside the door to manage 3-4 days without going out. They needed water as much as they could store before the barrel froze solid, because melting snow for water was possible, but inefficient and exhausting. Gideon listened to all of it. "I'll get the men started on the wood and water," he said. "What do you need from me for the food stores?" "Caleb and 2 others to help me move the crocks," she said. "Tomorrow morning, early, before the temperature drops any further." "Done," he said. He left. She sat for a moment with the inventory sheet in front of her and the fire going, and the sound of the wind beginning to pick up outside, not the storm yet. Just the ordinary Wyoming wind that preceded everything, the wind that was always there, under everything like the bass note of a song. She had prepared. She had planned. She had crocks full of preserved food in a cellar. She'd reorganized herself in 14 weeks of calculated sustenance between 20 men and hunger. She was still afraid. Not of the storm itself. She'd been through bad weather before, had sat out hard winters in hard buildings with less than she had now. The fear was more precise than that. It was the fear of the gap between what you'd prepared for and what actually arrived, the space where all the planning in the world met the thing that planning couldn't quite reach. She'd spent 3 months filling that space as completely as she could. She didn't know if it was enough. You never knew if it was enough until it was over. Storm arrived on a Thursday. The men woke that morning to a sky that had changed color overnight, not the ordinary gray of Wyoming cloud cover, but something deeper and more committed, the color of a decision already made. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since midnight. The wind had direction and purpose. By noon, the snow had started. By late afternoon, it was a wall. Evelyn had been in the cookhouse since before dawn. She'd moved through her preparations with the focused efficiency of someone who has run the scenario in their head enough times that the actual execution feels, if not familiar, at least comprehensible. The crocks were positioned where she needed them. The extra wood was stacked against the interior wall. The water barrel in the kitchen held as much as it would hold. She had mentally mapped the next 48 hours of meals and fuel consumption, and had made peace with the fact that some of those hours would require improvisation, regardless of how carefully she'd planned. Caleb arrived at first light and looked at the sky through the cookhouse window and said nothing for a long moment. "Bad?" "Yes," she said. "How bad?" She thought about the honest answer versus the useful answer and decided they were the same answer in this case. "Worse than most of us have seen," she said. "But we're ready for it." He took off his coat and hung it on the hook by the door and went to the stove to start the morning fire, and she noticed that he did it without being told, without checking in, without any of the small hesitations she'd been correcting out of him. Over the months, he just did it, efficiently and correctly, the way someone does something they've internalized rather than learned. The morning meals went out. The men ate and looked at the sky and talked in the lowered tones of people calculating risk. Gideon moved through the dining room and spoke to each cluster of men, calm and specific, telling them what needed to be done before the storm hit fully. The cattle moved to the closer pastures, cured. The bunkhouse supply of firewood doubled. By mid-afternoon, the cattle were in and the equipment was secured, and the storm had made its intentions undeniable. Evelyn kept the cookhouse fire burning at its highest safe level, which meant the room was almost unbearably warm compared to what was happening outside. She'd opened the small window vent twice to keep the temperature from becoming genuinely dangerous, and twice the wind had pushed back through it, hard enough to rattle the stove. The physical work of managing the kitchen in these conditions was harder than ordinary days, her body laboring in the heat while the storm screamed outside, and she let it be hard and kept working. By evening, the world outside the cookhouse windows had become a single, undifferentiated white. She sent supper to the bunkhouse via Caleb and Davis, who made the walk between buildings with a rope strung between them and the food wrapped inside their coats, which had been Gideon's idea and was a good one. The rope went up first, strung between the cookhouse and bunkhouse doors, and then the food went across, and then the men ate in the bunkhouse, with the fire going, and the storm making the walls shake, and Evelyn sat in the cookhouse and ate her own supper, and listened to Wyoming, trying to take everything apart. She was tired in a way that had no bottom to it. Kind of tired that was not just the day's work, but the accumulated work of months, the preservation and the planning and the calculation and the waking before dawn and the going to sleep after everyone else and the constant underlying maintenance of 20 men's needs that required attention, even when she was not actively addressing it. She sat with her bowl and the fire and the sound of the storm. She thought about the root cellar. She thought about 14 weeks of food, sitting in crocks she'd sealed herself. She thought about dried apples strung near the stove, and cured meat wrapped in cloth, and the barrel of lard, and the beans and the salt, and everything she'd assembled from late August to now. She had done what she could. Whatever the storm was going to do, she had done what she could. The second day was the hardest. The snow had piled against the bunkhouse door overnight, and two of the hands had spent the early morning clearing it, working in the wind with scarves wrapped around their faces, and they came into the cookhouse for breakfast, looking like men who had just had a disagreement with the weather and lost. Evelyn had hot food ready. She'd been up since 3, which was earlier than even her usual hour, because she'd woken and not been able to go back to sleep and had decided that the most useful response to being awake at 3 in the morning during a blizzard was to get the fire going and start on breakfast. The men ate. The storm kept going. By midday of the second day, the cold had worked its way into the spaces between things, the gaps in the bunkhouse walls, the seams of the cookhouse door, and the men who had started the storm with the boisterous energy of people confident in their ability to endure were quieter now, sitting closer to the fires, talking less. Harlan Pike, who had been rotating through the work of keeping the fire supplied in the bunkhouse, came to the cookhouse mid-afternoon and sat down without being invited, which was a first. "How long?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "The writer said 3-4 days for the main push. We're in the second day, 2 more days of this." He said it flatly. "Not a question." "Maybe," she said. "Probably." He looked at the fire. She watched him and thought about morale not as an abstract concept but as a practical concern, the same way she thought about fuel and food. 20 men in close quarters for an extended period of enforced inactivity developed predictable patterns. The first day was manageable. The second day was when the silence got thick. The third day was when the silence started producing friction, the kind of friction that built toward incidents that nobody wanted. She'd been thinking about this since the first morning. She went to the larder. The dried apples from Harlan's parcel and the additional stores she'd laid in were in the back, precisely where she'd placed them, behind the beans and the salt and the more pressing daily necessities. She'd been rationing them carefully, using small amounts in the morning porridge to give it flavor, saving the rest for something she hadn't quite committed to yet. She stood in the larder doorway, looking at the dried apples. Caleb appeared behind her. "What are you thinking?" he said. "Pie," she said. He looked at her. "We don't have enough sugar," he said. "I know," she said. "And the crust is going to be difficult with the flour situation." "I know," she said. "Is this a good use of resources right now?" Turned and looked at him fully. He was 18 years old and had been cooking alongside her for 4 months and had learned, during those 4 months, think about food the way she'd taught him, to think about it as a practical problem, with practical constraints and outcomes that could be measured. He was right. It was not, strictly speaking, a good use of resources. "No," she said. "It's not." She took the dried apples out of the larder. "Get me the flour," she said. He got the flour. She made the pie with what she had dried apple reconstituted with a little water and the last of the molasses, which gave it a darkness and a depth that sugar wouldn't have. The crust was imperfect, too thick on one side and slightly thin on the other, because the work table's center crack made rolling even dough genuinely difficult, and she'd done what she could. Put it in the oven and monitored it by smell, as much as by time, the way her father had taught her to manage an uncertain oven. Took an hour and a half. When it came out, it was lopsided, and the crust was a shade darker than optimal on the thick side, and it smelled like the best thing that had happened in the last 2 days, which was not a particularly high bar, but was also genuinely true. She told Caleb to carry it to the bunkhouse. He looked at it. He looked at her. "It's not exactly," he started. "Take it," she said. He wrapped it carefully and made the rope walk through the storm and disappeared into the white, stood at the cookhouse window and waited. She heard the laughter from the bunkhouse, through the storm, not at the pie, she thought, but with something, the particular quality of laughter that comes from being given something unexpected and small and unnecessary, that somehow addresses exactly the thing that the day has been building toward, without anyone being able to name it. Men who'd been sitting in silence for 2 days, cold and contained and increasingly tight with unexpressed tension, receiving a lopsided apple pie made from reconstituted dried fruit and molasses. Turned back to the stove, her arms ached. The kitchen was too hot. Outside, Wyoming was still trying to bury Blackridge Ranch under several feet of carefully delivered misery. She added wood to the fire and started planning tomorrow's breakfast. 1 meal at a time was the only way through anything. That was what she knew. That was what she'd always known. She knew it the way she knew everything that mattered, not from books or instruction, but from standing in kitchens under hard conditions and figuring out what was needed and making it happen. The storm pressed against the walls of the cookhouse. Inside, the fire held. The storm broke on the fourth day. Not gently. Wyoming didn't do anything gently in November, but the wall of white that had pressed against the cookhouse windows since Thursday finally thinned, and then thinned further. And by Thursday morning of the following week, the wind had dropped enough that a person could stand outside without the cold becoming an immediate physical argument. Skies was still low and gray and made no promises, but it had stopped delivering on the ones it had already made, and that was enough. Evelyn stood in the cookhouse doorway at first light and looked at what the storm had left behind. The yard was unrecognizable. The drifts had reached the lower windowsills of the bunkhouse on the north side and had buried the fence line on the east entirely, leaving only the tops of the posts visible like the fingers of a hand reaching up through white. The woodpile beside the bunkhouse was a smooth white mound. The water barrel was solid ice. The rope that had connected the two buildings through the storm's worst days hung slack and frosted between them, its purpose temporarily suspended. She stood there for a moment, breathing the cold air, which was clean in the way. Cold air always was, after heavy snow, without the dust or the smoke that usually sat in it. Then she went back inside and started breakfast. The men came in quieter than usual, which she'd expected. The fourth day of the storm had been the hardest, not in terms of physical conditions, which had actually begun to ease slightly, but in terms of the psychological weight of confinement. 20 men who worked outdoors by nature and necessity compressed into 2 buildings for 4 days with limited occupation. And the constant sound of wind. By the third night there had been 2 arguments, one of which had required Gideon to physically place himself between 2 of the younger hands, and one of which had resolved itself through the simple mechanism of both men running out of energy to sustain it. Pie had helped. She'd registered this without dwelling on it. The laughter she'd heard through the storm had a quality of genuine release, and the men who'd been in the bunkhouse when Caleb carried it in had been slightly more functional for the rest of that day and into the next. It hadn't fixed anything. It couldn't fix anything. But it had interrupted the accumulation of tension at a moment when interruption was what was needed, and that was what it had been made to do. Harlan Pike came to breakfast with the look of a man who had slept, finally, without the storm's noise as a constant companion. He sat down, looked at the food Evelyn placed in front of him: eggs she'd found miraculously unbroken in their packed straw, biscuits. The salt pork stretched further than it had any business being stretched, and ate without the usual sizing up pause. "Good to hear the wind stop," he said, to no one in particular. Several of the men made sounds of agreement. Davis, who was sitting across from him, said, "You think the pass is open?" "Not a chance," Harlan said. "Not for a week at least. So we're still cut off. Supply Road, maybe. We're not snowed in anymore. Big difference." Evelyn listened to this from the stove without interjecting, because Harlan was right, and the distinction he was making was the one that mattered. Being isolated from the supply road was a logistics problem, not an emergency. She had stores. She had a plan for those stores. The men could work again, which would matter enormously for their temperament, and the supply situation would resolve itself when the roads became passable, which Harlan's estimate of a week seemed reasonable. She went through her inventory that morning with more care than usual, updating the numbers now that the storm's main demand was behind her. She'd used more fuel than she'd anticipated. The stove had needed to run higher than planned to compensate for the cold that had worked into the building seams, which had affected some of her cooking time calculations. She'd also used the dried apple for the pie, which had been a deliberate choice, and she didn't regret it, but it meant adjusting the remaining plan. She sat with the numbers for a while. They worked. Not comfortably, the variety in the coming weeks would be limited, and she was going to have to be creative with beans in a way that even she found slightly daunting, but they worked. 20 men, adequately fed, for the duration of whatever the winter still had to say. Caleb came to look over her shoulder at the inventory sheet. "We okay?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the numbers more carefully. "Beans," he said. "Yes, a lot of beans. A substantial quantity of beans," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "You want me to start thinking about what we can do with them?" She looked up at him. He was 18 years old, and he'd just offered, without being asked, to take on a planning problem, not just the execution of a plan she'd already made, but the actual cognitive work of developing the plan. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened, but it had happened, and it was worth noting. "Yes," she said. Write down 3 things you haven't made before that use beans as the primary ingredient. Use what we have in the larder. I'll look at them tonight." He nodded and went to find paper. She went back to her inventory and felt beneath the tiredness and the sore arms and the lingering stiffness in her lower back from 4 days of high-demand kitchen work. Something quieter and more durable than satisfaction. Something that had to do with the gap between what she'd prepared and what the storm had actually required. And the fact that the gap had gone the right direction. She'd planned for 14 weeks. The storm had needed 4 days. Stores were intact. The men were fed. Whatever the winter still had in reserve, she was ready for it. The neighboring ranch sent a rider on the 6th day after the storm. She was in the middle of the noon preparation when she heard the hoofbeats in the yard, which were distinctive enough in the post-storm, quiet the snow, muffled most sounds, and horse breaking through the crust of it had a specific quality that she went to the window before she'd consciously decided to. The rider was a young man she didn't recognize, maybe 20, with the look of someone who'd been in the saddle longer than was comfortable and had come with something specific to say. He dismounted in the yard, and Gideon came out to meet him, and they stood talking in the cold air while the horse shifted its weight and breathed steam. She went back to the noon meal. Gideon came to the cookhouse 20 minutes later. He stood in the doorway with the cold still on his coat and his expression carefully arranged in a way she'd learned to read as his managing something face. "Faro Ranch," he said. 2 miles east. They're in trouble." She set down what she was working with. "What kind of trouble?" she said. "Their cook quit in September. They've been managing on their own through the storm, and they're short on food. 5 men and the family Harlan Faro, his wife, 2 daughters. The wife's been doing the cooking, but she didn't have stores laid in, and they stretched what they had through the storm." He paused. "The writer says they've got maybe a week of food at current consumption." She was already moving to the larder. She heard Gideon behind her. "I wanted to ask you before I committed to anything. At your stores." She stopped. She turned to look at him. It was an unusual thing for him to say. It was, technically, not accurate. The stores belonged to Blackridge Ranch, which belonged to Gideon Hale, which made them his in the legal and practical sense without any ambiguity. He knew that. She knew that. The fact that he'd said your stores was either a slip or a deliberate choice, and she didn't think Gideon Hale made many slips. "What do they need?" she said. "Enough to keep them through until the road opens. Call it 2 weeks." She did the calculation in her head. She'd been running the numbers with enough regularity that she could pull them up quickly what she had, what Blackridge needed, what the margin looked like against various contingencies. "I can spare beans," she said. "A full sack. Dried apple, I have some remaining. Lard." She thought pork? "Not much, but some." "That's significant," Gideon said. "It's manageable," she said. "Puts us tighter than I'd like, but it's manageable." She paused, because there was something else she was thinking about, and she wanted to say it correctly. "I'll write instructions," she said. "Specific ones for each thing. How to prepare it, how to make it last, what order to use things in." She looked at him. The wife has been managing without training for this kind of situation. Instructions will help more than the food alone. Gideon looked at her for a moment. "Write the instructions," he said. She spent an hour on them, while the noon meal finished cooking. She wrote clearly and without condescension, the way she'd write to someone who was competent but lacked specific knowledge practical, sequenced, with the reasoning attached so that a person could adapt if circumstances shifted. How to soak beans to reduce cooking time and fuel consumption. How to render lard efficiently. How to make the salt pork go further by using it as flavoring rather than bulk. How to portion things against a timeline rather than an appetite, which was the harder discipline but the more necessary one. She included a note at the end that was not about cooking. It said, "The hardest part of this is not the food. It is the waiting, keep the family occupied, small tasks, small purposes. The days pass faster when hands have something to do." She folded the instructions with the food parcels and handed everything to Gideon. He looked at the parcel, he looked at her. "This is a lot of work," he said. "People you don't know." "They're in trouble," she said. "That's enough." He took the parcel. She went back to the noon meal, which had been sitting longer than she intended and needed immediate attention. The writer took the supplies back to Faro Ranch, and that seemed to be the end of it. Functionally, the supply line established. The need met, the matter resolved. Evelyn went back to managing Blackridge's kitchen through the tail end of the winter with the resources she had, and she did not think much more about the Faro family until 3 weeks later when a wagon came up the road and stopped in the yard. She heard it from the cookhouse and assumed it was the supply wagon, which was overdue by about 4 days. The road had opened more slowly than Harlan's estimate had suggested, which she'd planned for, and the 4 additional days of tightened rationing had been unpleasant but manageable. The men had complained about the beans, which she had expected, and Caleb had implemented 2 of his 3 experimental bean preparations with mixed results. One of them was actually good, and she'd told him so, and one of them was genuinely not good, and she'd told him that too, which he'd received with the expression of a person who has been given accurate feedback they'd been hoping to avoid. But the wagon that came up the road was not the supply wagon. It was a farm wagon, older, with a woman driving it, and a bundle of something in the back. Evelyn was at the cookhouse window when it pulled into the yard, and she watched Gideon come out to meet the woman who climbed down from the wagon seat with the careful movement of someone not entirely accustomed to doing that climb alone. She was maybe 40 thin in the hard-worn way of women who worked frontier farms, with dark hair under a practical hat, and the expression of someone who had made a decision and was going to carry it through regardless of whether it became awkward. Evelyn dried her hands and went out. Gideon was making introductions as she arrived. The woman was Harlan Farrow's wife, whose name was Ruth. She had driven herself from the Farrow Ranch, 2 miles east, which was not a short drive in post-storm conditions with roads that were technically open, but still carrying significant ice in the shaded sections. Ruth Farrow looked at Evelyn with the direct assessment of a woman who'd been thinking about what she was going to say to this person for some time. "You wrote those instructions," Ruth said. It was not a question. "Yes," Evelyn said. "The one about keeping the family occupied." Ruth paused. "I read that one probably 15 times, Evelyn waited. "My girls are 8 and 11, Ruth said. "I'd been trying to keep them calm, and they were frightened, and I didn't have anything. I couldn't think of anything to give them to do that would actually help, rather than just..." She stopped. She looked at the wagon. "I had them help me with the rationing, counting out the portions. Your instructions explained it clearly enough that they could follow along, and it gave them something to do with their hands." She looked back at Evelyn. The 11-year-old figured out on her own that we could stretch the beans further if we used smaller amounts of lard in the preparation and added more water. I wouldn't have thought to let her try. Evelyn said nothing. There was nothing to say that would add to that. "I brought eggs," Ruth said, gesturing toward the wagon. 2 dozen. "The hens survived the storm better than I expected. I wanted to bring something." "You didn't have to," Evelyn said. "I know that," Ruth said, with a firmness that suggested this point had already been considered and set aside. Evelyn helped her carry the eggs in from the wagon. Ruth came inside the cookhouse, which she looked around with the attention of a practical woman, examining another practical woman's workspace not critically, but with recognition, noting the organization, the positioning of things, the visible evidence of a kitchen that had been made to work. "You prepared all this before the storm," Ruth said. It was the same not-quite question quality that Ruth Farrow seemed to favor. "From late August," Evelyn said. Ruth looked at the crocks on the shelves. She looked at the larder. She looked at the work table where Caleb had left his bean preparation notes. "How did you know?" "Ruth signs," Evelyn said. "The way the summer ended the animals. Information from the supply wagon drivers." She paused. And some of it was just, it seemed like the right thing to prepare for, regardless of whether the winter turned out to be bad. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I didn't prepare," she said. Not with guilt exactly, but with the honest assessment of someone who'd learned something at cost and was accounting for it clearly. "I thought we had enough. I thought what we had was enough." "It usually is," Evelyn said. "Most winters what you have is enough. But not this one. Not this one." Ruth Farrow sat down at the work table, not waiting for an invitation. Just sitting, the way women sit in kitchens when a conversation has reached the part where you need to be still for a minute. And Evelyn poured 2 cups of coffee, which was the correct response. They sat with the coffee and the fire and the afternoon light coming through the small window. And Ruth talked about the storm and the girls and the 11-year-old's discovery about the lard. And Evelyn listened and occasionally said something. And it was the kind of conversation that didn't have a particular destination, but arrived somewhere anyway. When Ruth left, Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched the wagon make its way back down the road. And she thought about an 11-year-old girl figuring out the lard ratio and feeling the satisfaction of a problem solved, thought about the note she'd written at the end of the instructions, the one about keeping hands busy, and she thought that sometimes the most useful thing you could put in a parcel was not the food, but the thinking that went alongside it. Gideon came to her that evening. This was not unusual. He came to the cookhouse most evenings for his coffee, and sometimes stayed a few minutes after, looking at the fire, or at his cup, or out the window, at whatever part of the ranch yard was visible from that angle. She'd gotten used to it. The rhythm of it had become part of the cookhouse's ordinary life. But tonight he didn't sit. He stood at the work table and turned his coffee cup in both hands, which was his thinking posture, and she let him think while she worked. "The Faro Ranch," he said after a while. "Yes?" she said. "Faro came by this afternoon, while you were doing the kitchen cleanup." She looked up from what she was doing. "He wanted to thank me," Gideon said, "for the supplies." He paused. "I told him the supplies weren't mine to take credit for." She waited. He said to pass on his thanks to the cook. She looked back at what she was doing. "I told him the cook had also sent instructions," Gideon said. He said Ruth had told him about the instructions. He said his daughter, the younger one, the 8-year-old, had memorized the part about the beans and had been reciting it to her mother as they cooked. Evelyn made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was related to one. Gideon set the cup down. "You saved that family," he said. She shook her head, not from false modesty but from precision. "The food saved them. Pharaoh's wife saved them. She did the actual work with what I sent." "You planned for there to be enough to send," Gideon said. "Nobody else on this ranch was thinking about that in August." "I was thinking about Blackridge," she said. "The Faro Ranch benefited from what I did for Blackridge." "Evelyn." She looked at him. He was standing at the work table with the coffee cup, and his face had the expression she'd been seeing more of recently, the one that was not the careful neutrality of a man managing a ranch, but something more direct and less managed than that. "You knew this winter was going to be bad," he said. "You prepared for it. You kept 20 men fed through 4 days of a blizzard without anyone going hungry and without burning through what we needed to survive the rest of the season. And you had enough left to save a family 2 miles east who didn't have anyone thinking ahead for them." She looked at him steadily. "And you did all of that," he said, "while a significant portion of this ranch spent the first 3 weeks you were here, laughing at the way you walked into the yard." The fire crackled. Outside, the January wind was doing what January wind did, though without the malice of last month's storm. "People laugh at what they don't understand," she said. "I didn't stop them," he said, "the first night. In the yard. I came out and I saw what Silas had done, and I didn't." He stopped. He picked up the coffee cup again, not to drink from it, but to have something to do with his hands. Should have said something. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the conversation she hadn't expected. Not because she hadn't thought about that first night she had, in the small hours of various mornings since August, in the honest internal accounting that happened when the work was done and the fire was low. She'd thought about the ladle in the dirt and the laughter and Gideon, watching it all from across the yard and doing the calculation she'd learned to recognize, the calculation where a man decides that the disruption of intervening outweighs whatever is happening to the person who needs intervention. She'd understood it. She'd understood it and moved past it, because moving past things was the only viable option when you arrived somewhere with $2 and a worn satchel and no alternatives. She hadn't forgotten it. "You gave me the chance to cook," she said. "That was what I needed." "That's not the same thing," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." A silence. "Telling you now," he said, "because I think it should be said." She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been doing since August, cataloging things. He was not a man who said difficult things easily. The words had cost him something, which was apparent in the way they'd come out, and the cost of them was a kind of honesty that she found, unexpectedly, harder to receive than the alternative. "I appreciate it," she said. He nodded once. He drank the last of his coffee. "Fly wagon should be through in the next few days," he said, returning to the practical register that was more natural to both of them. "I'll have them bring whatever you need." "I'll have the list ready," she said. He left. She stood at the work table for a moment without doing anything, which was unusual for her. She was not in the habit of standing without purpose. But she stood there with the fire and the evening and the sound of the wind outside, and she thought about the first night and the ladle and the 20 feet of dusty yard between herself and the cookhouse door, and she thought about everything that had come after it. And she found that the weight of it was not lighter, exactly. The things that had happened had still happened, but they sat differently now, organized by context rather than isolation, part of a longer story whose middle sections she could now see clearly enough to judge the thing as a whole. She picked up her cloth and finished wiping down the work table. Tomorrow's breakfast list was already in her head. She went to write it down. Supply wagon came 4 days later with everything she'd ordered, and a letter from the supplier in Cheyenne that Gideon brought to her without explanation, just handed over and stood there while she opened it. It was from the owner of the supply company, a man named Henderson, who wrote in the compressed style of someone accustomed to communicating practical information efficiently. He had heard through Pharaoh about the provisions that had come from Blackridge during the storm. He understood that the Blackridge cook had also written preparation instructions. He was writing to ask, directly, whether those instructions might be adapted for a broader distribution. He had 6 ranches in his regular supply circuit, and 2 of them had come through the winter in poor condition. For the same reason Pharaoh had, inadequate preparation, inadequate knowledge of how to use what they had. He was willing to pay for the instructions, if they could be put in a form he could distribute. He named a figure. Evelyn read the letter twice. She handed it back to Gideon. "What do you think?" she said. He read it. He handed it back. "I think it's a reasonable offer," he said, "and I think the instructions would help people." "It would take time," she said. "Time I'm using for the kitchen." "I can make adjustments," he said, "if you wanted to do it." She looked at the letter. She thought about Ruth Pharaoh's 8-year-old daughter memorizing the part about the beans. She thought about 11-year-old arithmetic applied to lard ratios in a cold farmhouse during a storm. She thought about her father's way station and the travelers who arrived without enough of anything, and how the thing that had helped them most was not charity, but information-specific, practical, applicable information about how to make what they had into what they needed. "Tell him I'll do it," she said. Gideon took the letter. She went back to the stove. February at Blackridge had a different quality than the months that preceded it, not warmer, not easier on the body, but inhabited differently. The men had come through the storm together, and the coming through had changed something between them in the small daily ways that shared hardship tends to change things between people who survive it. The arguments that had crept up in the bunkhouse during the 4th day of confinement were not forgotten, but they'd been absorbed into the ongoing texture of men who were now, at some level they probably couldn't have articulated, more thoroughly known to each other than they'd been in November. They talked more at meals. Not always about important things, mostly. Not about important things. The way most good conversation mostly isn't about important things. They told stories. They argued about cattle and about weather and about the relative merits of various approaches to fence repair, which could apparently sustain extended debate among men who worked with fences daily. They laughed more often, and the laughter had an easier quality than it had in the fall. Evelyn registered all of this from the cookhouse, with the same attention she gave everything at Blackridge, noting it, filing it, understanding it as part of the larger picture of what the ranch was and what it needed. She also noticed that the men had started doing something she hadn't explicitly asked for. When a new hand arrived at Blackridge in early February, a young man named Fletcher, replacing one of the hands who had left after the storm to return to his family in Kansas, the men showed him around the bunkhouse, the yard, the equipment, standard introduction. But then Harlan Pike brought him to the cookhouse door. "This is Mrs. Rourke," Harlan said. "She runs the kitchen. You want to eat well, you make her job easier. You have a problem with the food, you say so to her face, not behind her back. You leave the kitchen stores alone." Fletcher looked at Evelyn. He was young, maybe 22, and had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving a lot of information in a short time. "Yes, sir," he said, reflexively, to Harlan, then seemed to realize that wasn't quite right. "Ma'am," he corrected to Evelyn. She nodded. "Welcome to Blackridge," she said. "Supper's at 6. Harlan took Fletcher back toward the bunkhouse. Caleb, who had witnessed this from the work table, looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "He gave him the kitchen rules," Caleb said. "I noticed," she said. "Nobody told him to do that." "No," she said, "they didn't." She went back to what she was doing. Carried that moment with her through the rest of the day, the image of Harlan Pike standing at the cookhouse door, delivering the kitchen protocols to a new hand, with the seriousness of someone passing on information that matters. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had assigned it. He'd done it because somewhere between August and February, it had become the kind of thing that simply happened at Blackridge Ranch when someone new arrived. Thought about what that meant. She didn't let herself think about it too directly, because the thing she was circling was sentimental in a way she wasn't entirely comfortable with, and she had learned over the years that sentiment worked better when you approached it sideways rather than head-on. But she was aware of it, the thing that had happened to this ranch. Between August and now, The change that she could see in the way the men moved through the dining room and the yard and the ordinary days of ranch life. Cookhouse had become something. She wasn't sure she had precise language for what it had become, but it was something beyond a place where food was made and eaten. It was the room where the ranch organized itself around warmth, and that function had been there since the first supper, when 20 men had gone quiet over beans and salt pork and molasses, and Gideon Hale had emptied his bowl without theatrics. She'd built that. Not alone Caleb had built it alongside her, and Gideon had allowed it, and the men had received it. But the building had started with her, in an August kitchen with bad flour and too much salt and a ladle that had been thrown at her feet. Counted the eggs Fletcher had gathered from the henhouse which he'd brought to the cookhouse as his first contribution to the kitchen order. 11 eggs. Not bad for February. She planned breakfast around them. Nolan came on the first warm day of late February, which wasn't warm by any reasonable measure, was warm relative to everything that had preceded it. The temperature had climbed above freezing by midday, and the snow was doing the first tentative work of becoming something other than snow along the south-facing edges of things. He looked different. She noticed it immediately and spent the first few minutes of his visit trying to put her finger on what it was. He wasn't taller, or if he was not noticeably so. He wasn't wearing better clothes. He didn't look like a boy who had been through an easy winter, because his winter had not been easy. But something in his face had changed. The watchfulness was still there, that was probably permanent, the particular alertness of a child who'd learned to monitor his environment carefully. But there was something alongside it that hadn't been there in the fall. Something that was not quite confidence, but was adjacent to it. "How did you get through?" she asked. "Meaning the storm, meaning the winter, meaning all of it. Food you sent," he said. "And my ma figured out the instructions pretty well. She made me read them to her twice." "Your mother can read," Evelyn said. "She reads fine," he said, with a flicker of defensiveness that she noted but didn't address. "She just wanted to hear it out loud. And your mother is—" "She's okay," he said. "She wants to come and thank you herself. She's been saying it since the storm. She's just—" he paused. "She's proud." "I know," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because she raised you," Evelyn said. "And you have the same look she does when someone hands you something you didn't ask for." He considered this. Then he said, "I've been cooking at home. Using what you showed me. The beans mostly. And the biscuits, they come out wrong still, but less wrong than at first." She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. "Less wrong is progress," she said. "Caleb says I'm gripping the dough too hard still." "Caleb is right," she said. "Come back tomorrow, and we'll work on it." He nodded. He ate the food she put in front of him. She'd stopped wrapping things for him to take away weeks ago, after it became clear that his visits had shifted from necessity into something more like habit, and that feeding him here was better than sending him away with a parcel. He ate with less urgency than he had in the fall, which was the most concrete evidence she had that the winter food situation had been survivable. After he left, she stood in the cookhouse and thought about Mara Reed sitting in a drafty farmhouse, reading instructions out loud to herself, while her son listened. And she thought about an 11-year-old Pharaoh girl doing lard ratios. And she thought about Fletcher learning the kitchen rules from Harlan Pike on his first day. And she thought about Caleb at the work table with his list of 3 bean preparations, one of which had actually been good. She thought about what you built when you weren't building anything in particular, just doing the daily work of the thing you knew how to do, showing up before dawn and keeping the fire going, and paying attention to what people needed before they knew how to ask for it. She thought about Gideon in the yard on that first August night, watching the men laugh, making his calculation. She thought about the ladle in the dust. She went to the larder and checked the inventory, which she always did at the end of the afternoon, a habit so ingrained it had become almost meditative, the daily accounting of what was there and what it meant for the days ahead. Stores were lower than they'd been in November. Naturally, the winter had taken what it needed from them, but there was enough. More than enough if she was careful and the supply wagon kept to its schedule. She wrote the evening meal list. Beans, because there were still beans. Salt pork, biscuits. She'd teach Nolan the grip tomorrow, and she'd teach him right, because less wrong was progress, but correct was the goal, and she had enough patience left for correct. And whatever Caleb thought he could do with the dried apple, she'd been hoarding for a week, because she thought the men needed something that wasn't strictly necessary, just pleasant, kind of thing that reminded a person that survival and comfort were not mutually exclusive, that you could keep 20 men alive through a Wyoming winter, and also not instead of, but also make something worth tasting on a cold February afternoon. She pulled the dried apple from the back of the larder. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it on the work table and called for Caleb. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, not as an arrival, but as a negotiation. Cold and warmth trading the same week back and forth, until warmth finally accumulated enough advantage to hold the ground it gained. The mud came first. The yard at Blackridge turned into something that grabbed at boot heels and made every trip between buildings a deliberate effort. And the men complained about the mud with the particular enthusiasm of people who had run out of storm to complain about and needed something to fill the space. Evelyn's listened to the mud complaints with more tolerance than she'd had for the storm complaints, because the mud meant the ground was thawing, which meant the kitchen garden she'd been planning since February could actually begin. She'd found the garden plot herself behind the cookhouse on the south-facing side, a strip of ground, maybe 12 feet by 20, that had been used for something at some point. She could tell by the way the soil was looser there than the surrounding ground, and then abandoned. She'd mentioned it to Gideon in passing, and he'd said to do what she thought best with it, which was, she had come to understand, his standard authorization for anything she proposed that didn't involve significant expense. She started the seeds in the cookhouse in late March, in small clay pots she'd purchased from a farm woman's wagon for 15 cents. Tomatoes, which were ambitious for Wyoming, but not impossible in a sheltered south-facing location. Onions, which were practical. Carrots. 2 varieties of bean, because she had opinions about beans at this point that she hadn't had in August. Herbs, thyme, because it survived hard conditions. And sage, because it made everything around it smell like something worth eating. Caleb watched her set up the seed pots on the cookhouse windowsill, with the expression he'd been developing over the winter, the one that was somewhere between admiration and the slightly stunned recognition that she was always, apparently, about 3 months ahead of whatever he was currently thinking about. "You're already planning for fall," he said. "I'm planning for summer," she said. "Fall planning starts in June." He shook his head, not in disagreement, but in the way a person shakes their head when they've stopped being surprised by something and moved into a different category of response. "I want to learn that," he said, the ahead thinking. "I can do the cooking now. Most of it. But I don't—" He paused, looking for the right words. "I don't see it yet. The whole shape of it. I see what's in front of me." She looked at him. He was 18, and what he'd just said was one of the most honest things she'd heard him say, which was considerable because Caleb was generally honest. He just wasn't usually that precise about his own limitations. "You will," she said. "It takes longer than cooking. You have to make enough mistakes that you know where the gaps are, and then you have to care enough to fill them." She turned back to the seed pots. "You're already doing it. You just don't see it, because you're in the middle of it." He thought about this. "How long did it take you?" he said. Considered that honestly. "I'm still doing it," she said. Mara Reed came in April. She came on a morning when the mud had dried enough that the road was passable without constant anxiety. Driving a small cart with a horse that had clearly seen better decades, but was still functional, and she pulled up in the Blackridge yard with the careful precision of a woman who had decided to do a thing and was going to do it correctly from start to finish. Evelyn was in the kitchen garden when she arrived. She'd gotten the seedlings into the ground the week before and was doing the daily check that early planted seedlings required, which was less about doing anything and more about looking, because the difference between a seedling that needed intervention and one that just needed time was something you could only determine by looking closely and often. She heard the cart and came around the side of the cookhouse and stopped. The woman climbing down from the cart was thin and upright, with dark hair shot through with gray that she wore pulled back with a practicality that suggested aesthetics were not her primary concern. She was maybe 35, though the frontier had a way of adding years to faces that made precise estimation unreliable. She moved with care, the way people moved when their body had been through a hard season, and was still accounting for the cost of it. Nolan jumped down from the cart behind her. He saw Evelyn, and something in his face shifted relief, she thought. Or maybe just the particular comfort of seeing a known person in a situation that required navigating an unknown one. The woman walked across the yard toward Evelyn with the directness of someone who had rehearsed this and was going to execute it before the rehearsal faded. "Mrs. Rourke," she said. "Mrs. Reed," Evelyn said. They stood in the April yard looking at each other for a moment. Mara Reed had Nolan's eyes. She noticed the same watchfulness, the same quality of assessment running underneath the surface of ordinary expression. "I've been meaning to come since January," Mara said. Took me longer than I intended. You had a hard winter, Evelyn said. We did. Mara paused. She had the quality of a person choosing words carefully, not because she was uncertain of what she felt, because precision mattered to her. Your food kept us. The instructions kept us, maybe more than the food. I read them so many times I can recite them. Evelyn thought about what to say to that and decided that what she'd said to Harlan Pike and to Nolan was still the right answer. Don't mention it. Mara Reed looked at her sharply, and Evelyn understood immediately that this was the wrong answer for Mara Reed, who had come specifically to mention it, and for whom the dismissal was not the comfortable deflection it was meant to be, but something closer to a door closed in her face. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. I'm glad it helped. I'm glad you're both here. Mara's expression softened slightly. Nolan talks about you constantly, she said. He talks about the biscuits. He talks about Caleb. He talks about the ranch. She looked around the yard with the assessing gaze she'd inherited or transmitted to her son. He's different than he was in the summer. Before he started coming here. Evelyn looked at Nolan, who was standing slightly behind his mother and watching this exchange with an expression of acute discomfort that was entirely normal for a 12-year-old watching an adult discuss him. He's been learning, Evelyn said. He learns fast when he cares about something. He cooked supper last month. Mara said beans and biscuits. The biscuits weren't right, but they were less wrong. Nolan said, from behind her, with a flatness that suggested he'd heard this story before. Less wrong, Mara agreed without turning around. Corner of her mouth moved. I ate every bit of it. They stood in the yard a moment longer, and then Evelyn said, come inside. I'll make coffee. Mara Reed sat at the cookhouse work table and drank coffee and looked around the kitchen. With the attention Evelyn had seen from Ruth Farrow, the practical recognition of another practical space, the inventory taken in a single long look. Nolan sat beside his mother and ate the biscuit. Evelyn put in front of him with the focused efficiencies of someone who had not stopped being hungry even after a survivable winter. He wants to cook, Mara said. Properly. Not just at home, he talks about it like it's a thing a person could do. A real thing. Evelyn looked at Nolan, who was looking at the biscuit with the careful attention of someone studying its construction. He can, she said. Mara looked at her. He has the instinct for it, Evelyn said. That's the part you can't teach. The rest is time and repetition. She looked at Nolan directly. The grip on the dough is still too hard. I know, he said, without looking up. Come on Thursday and we'll fix it properly. He looked up then, checking his mother's face. Mara Reed was looking at Evelyn with an expression that was complicated gratitude and something that was not quite resistance, but was adjacent to it. The friction of a proud woman accepting something large and consequential from someone she had not yet fully decided how to categorize. He won't be any trouble, Mara said finally. He's never any trouble, Evelyn said, which was mostly true. Thursday, then. The instructions for Henderson's supply company took her 6 weeks to write properly. Not because the content was complicated, she knew what needed to be said, but because writing for people she'd never met, in situations she couldn't fully anticipate, required a different discipline than writing for Ruth Farrow or managing her own kitchen. She had to think about the range of what someone might know and not know, what questions they wouldn't think to ask, what assumptions they'd make that would lead them wrong. She worked on it in the evenings, at the work table after the kitchen was cleaned and the fire was banked. Caleb sometimes sat with her, doing his own writing. He'd started keeping a cooking journal she'd suggested, and which he'd initially resisted, and which now occupied him most evenings, with intensity that told her it had become genuinely important to him. They worked in a companionable quiet that had developed over months, the kind of silence between two people who have spent enough time together that the absence of conversation is its own form of it. Who are you writing it for? Caleb asked one evening, looking up from his journal. Ranches, she said. Farm families. Anyone who needs to put food up for winter and doesn't know how. It's a lot of different people. Yes, she said. How do you write for people you don't know? She thought about that. You assume they're competent, she said. You assume they know their own situation better than you do, and you give them the information they need to apply their own judgment. She looked at the page in front of her. The mistake people make is writing down to whoever they think they're addressing. It makes the writing useless because the person reading it can tell. Caleb looked at his journal. Is that what you did with me, he said. Assumed I was competent. She looked at him. From the first morning, she said. Kept the fire even without being told twice. That was enough. He was quiet for a moment. I wasn't, though, he said. Not at first. I burned things. I miscalculated the water on the grain at least 4 times. Competent doesn't mean perfect, she said. It means capable of learning. Those are different things. She picked up her pen. Most people are competent. They just need someone to treat them like they are. She went back to writing. She sent the finished document to Henderson in late May, along with a brief letter that explained her approach and offered to revise if he thought sections were unclear. Henderson wrote back within 2 weeks the man ran an efficient operation and said the instructions were exactly what he'd hoped for, and he was going to distribute them with the next round of supply deliveries to the ranches on his circuit. He also increased his payment by 15% over what he'd originally offered, with a note that said the quality warranted it, which she appreciated both for the money and for the precision of the reasoning. Put the payment in her locked box, which now contained enough, between her savings and wages, to represent a genuine material fact rather than a theoretical aspiration. She sat with that for a moment. On the evening, she did the accounting. She had arrived at Blackridge with $2.14. She did not dwell on the distance between that number and the current one, because dwelling was not productive, and she had learned over years that the most useful thing you could do with money you'd earned through hard work was to think clearly about what it was for. She noted it, the way you note a landmark not as a destination but as evidence of ground covered. Summer at Blackridge was a different animal than winter. The work was harder in terms of heat and hours. The men started earlier and worked later. The cattle required more management in the summer pastures, and the cookhouse in July became an environment that tested the limits of what a person could reasonably be asked to endure while maintaining a cooking fire. She managed it with the window vent and a system of timing that minimized the longest burning preparations during the peak heat hours, and she drank more water than she had in any previous summer of her life and accepted that this was simply the cost. Gideon noticed in July that she was losing weight. She knew it before he said anything. She'd been aware of it since spring. The way the daily physical demand of the kitchen was working on her body differently, now that she was regularly fed and regularly active in a sustained way rather than the sporadic hard labor punctuated by scarcity that had characterized the years after Daniel died. She was still heavy. She would probably always be heavy. Her body had its own architecture, and she had made a kind of peace with it over years. Specific peace of a woman who has decided that her body is the instrument she works with rather than the statement she makes. But she was than she had been in August. She could feel the difference in the way she managed the kitchen's physical demands, the lifting, the sustained heat, the long hours on her feet. The exhaustion at the end of a day was different from the exhaustion she'd arrived with. Cleaner, more functional, the exhaustion of a body that had been used rather than depleted. Gideon said, "You look different than you did in August." She said, "So does the ranch." He looked at her. With that expression, she'd gotten better at reading over the months, the one that was not the ranch manager face, but something more personal. "I moved the spare room on the east side," he said. "The one with the window that gets the morning light. It's bigger than your current room. Better ventilated." He paused. "You want it?" She looked at him. "The storage room off the back is fine," she said, which was true and also not the point. "I know it's fine," he said. "I'm offering you something better than fine." She thought about the storage room, with its old rope smell and its narrow cot and the small window that faced north and gave her gray light in the mornings. She thought about it honestly, without the sentimentality that can accumulate around a difficult place simply because you survived there. "Yes," she said. "I'll take it." She moved her things that weekend, her locked box. Her worn satchel that had been worn when she arrived and was now considerably more so. The 2 additional dresses she'd purchased with her wages. Her father's copy of a cookery book that she'd been carrying since Abilene, and which she still consulted occasionally, not because she needed the recipes, but because his handwritten notes in the margins were worth returning to. The east room had a window that filled with morning light exactly as advertised. Stood in it the first morning, and looked out at the summer yard and thought, "This is mine now, not the room." She wasn't confused about the ownership of the room. She meant something else. Caleb turned 19 in October, and she made him a cake. Not from dried stores this time. She had fresh eggs and real sugar, and the kitchen garden had given her sage that she used in everything now. Though not the cake, obviously. The cake was a simple thing, a single layer, correctly baked, with a texture she was genuinely satisfied with, which was a higher standard than satisfied the men who ate it. She told him happy birthday, and he looked at the cake and then at her, and said, with the directness that had become more characteristic of him as he'd gotten older, that he'd been thinking about his future. She poured them both coffee and sat down. "I want to cook," he said. Not just here. I mean, here is good. Here is where I learned. But I want to, he stopped. Henderson's been talking to Gideon about expanding the supply routes. There are new settlements east of here, more ranches coming in. He needs people who know food. Not just buying and selling it, but knowing it. The way you know it, she looked at him. You're 19, she said. I know, the knowing takes time, I know that too. He looked at his coffee. I'm not saying now, I'm saying that's where I'm going. I wanted you to know. She thought about a 17-year-old boy appearing in a cookhouse doorway with his hat in his hand asking if she needed help. Thought about biscuits pressed too hard, grain with the water added wrong, 4 burned things and a 5th one almost right, and a 6th one that was genuinely correct. She thought about a cooking journal filled with the concentrated attention of someone who had decided, at some point she couldn't precisely identify, that this was worth caring about seriously. You should go, she said. He looked up. When the time is right, she said. When you're ready and the opportunity is right, you should go. She picked up her coffee. What you've learned here goes with you. That's the point of learning it. He nodded. He looked at the cake. Is this what it felt like, he said, when you left Abilene? She thought about that honestly. She thought about the way Station and her father, and the years after, the marriage that had been decent for a while and then wasn't, creditors and the house and the road to Blackridge, with its broken wagon and its 4 days of dust and its 2.14 endpoint. No, she said, when I left Abilene, I wasn't choosing. I was running out of options. She set the cup down. What you're describing is different. You choose while you still have choices. That's better. She looked at him. Don't wait until you're out of options. Go while you can go on your own terms. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to be okay? He said. Here. Without Caleb, she said. Yes? I was managing this kitchen before you arrived. I'll manage it after. I know, he said. Eat your cake, she said. He ate his cake. She drank her coffee. Outside, October was doing what October did in Wyoming, threatening what November would confirm. And inside the cookhouse, the fire was steady, and the morning light came through the east window at an angle that had become, over the past year, as familiar as any light she'd known. Gideon came to the cookhouse on a November evening a year, and 3 months after she'd arrived. The men had gone to the bunkhouse. Nolan had been and gone. He came twice a week now, formal lessons that she'd structured with the same practical attention she gave everything. And he was good enough with the biscuits that she'd stopped correcting the grip and moved on to other things. Caleb had started talking seriously with Henderson about the eastern routes, which meant he would probably leave in the spring, which she was prepared for, and still slightly not prepared for, which she supposed was normal. Gideon came in and poured his own coffee, which he had been doing for months. He'd stopped waiting for her to pour it since somewhere around February, and she'd noted this at the time as a small domestic shift that meant something she hadn't fully articulated. He sat at the work table. She was finishing the week's accounting. She still kept meticulous records, though the records now included the kitchen garden yields and the Henderson instruction payments and the inventory of preserved stores for the coming winter, which she'd been building since August. The anniversary had passed without her marking it formally, but she'd been aware of it. You remember the first night, Gideon said. She looked up from the accounting. Which part of it, she said. All of it. He turned the coffee cup. I've been thinking about it lately. The woman who walked into the yard with a satchel and $2 and Silas's ladle in the dirt. He paused. I almost sent you away. I know, she said. Not because I thought you couldn't cook, he said. I didn't know whether you could cook. I almost sent you away because it was easier. Because Silas wanted you gone, and dealing with Silas was more effort than I had in me that day. And you were, he stopped. He looked at the cup. You were easy to dismiss. That's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. You were easy to dismiss, and I almost did it. She set down her pen. She thought about what to say. She'd had this conversation in her head, in various forms, over the past year, not obsessively, but it had come up, the way significant things come up when you have quiet and honesty to work with. She'd worked through her version of it alone, which was probably the right order of operations. You gave me the chance, she said. That's what mattered. Only because you pushed for it, he said. You made the offer I couldn't reasonably refuse. If you hadn't, he shook his head. If I hadn't, I would have found somewhere else, she said. Or I would have figured out something else. I would have managed. You don't know that. No, she said, but I believe it. I'd been managing for a long time before Blackridge. She looked at him directly. What I found here was better than managing. That's different. He looked back at her. Outside, the November wind had picked up the ordinary November wind, Not a storm, just the season doing what it did. She'd already started the winter stores. She'd already done the calculations. She was, as she had been in August of the previous year, approximately 3 months ahead of whatever the winter was going to ask of her, and the root cellar was better organized and more fully stocked than it had ever been. And she knew this ranch's rhythms now the way she'd known her father's way station from the inside, in the way that takes a year to acquire and can't be rushed. Blackridge is different too, Gideon said quietly. Then it was. She thought about Harlan Pike delivering kitchen rules to the new hand. She thought about Davis making the rope walk through the storm with supper tucked inside his coat. She thought about the men who lingered after supper on ordinary evenings, now talking, the specific quality of men who had somewhere they felt comfortable being. Yes, she said, you did that, he said. We did it, she said. The men did it. You did it by letting it happen. She picked up her pen again. I cooked the food. People did the rest themselves. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like you to stay. She looked at him. I'm already staying, she said. I mean, he stopped. He was not a man who fumbled words, and the fumbling was its own information. I mean, I'd like you to stay because you want to, not because you need the wages and the position. Because he looked at the window, then back at her. Because this is yours too if you want it to be. She understood what he was saying. She sat with it for a moment, not performing consideration, but actually considering the way she considered everything that mattered, slowly and honestly, without rushing toward the answer she might want, and without flinching from the one that was true. She thought about arriving in this yard with $2 and dust on her boots and a ladle thrown at her feet. She thought about the storage room with the rope smell, and the east room with the morning light, and the kitchen garden behind the cookhouse, and the crocks in the root cellar, and Nolan's biscuits getting less wrong week by week, and Caleb's journal full of careful notes, and Harlan Pike with a paper-wrapped parcel of dried apple, and Ruth Farrow's 8-year-old daughter reciting the bean instructions. Thought about her father's way station, and the travelers who arrived without enough of anything, and what he had taught her about the difference between a place you worked and a place you belonged to. She had been working at Blackridge. She had stopped noticing, somewhere between the storm and the spring, that she had also started belonging to it. I want it to be, she said. Gideon nodded. The careful neutrality of his face was gone, not replaced with anything theatrical, because he was not a theatrical man, and she would not have trusted a theatrical response. Just the face underneath the management, simpler and more readable and entirely genuine. Good, he said. He drank his coffee. She went back to the accounting. The fire held. The wind moved over the roof of the cookhouse, the way wind moves over a place that has been properly built to endure it. And in the yard beyond the window, the November dark had settled over Blackridge Ranch over the bunkhouse, where the men were arguing about something that probably mattered very little, and yet mattered to them enormously. Over the root cellar full of stores she'd laid in with her own hands, over the kitchen garden dormant under the first cold, the seeds of next year already waiting inside the frozen ground. She would be up before dawn. There would be 20 men to feed, plus Nolan on Thursday, plus whatever the day produced that she hadn't anticipated, which was always something. She would keep the fire. She would count what she had. She would look ahead to what was coming and prepare for it as thoroughly as any person could prepare, knowing that preparation met the future only halfway, and that the other half required staying present and clear-eyed when the plan met the thing the plan hadn't accounted for. She had been doing this her whole life. She intended to keep doing it. There is something that people misunderstand about strength, which is that they think it announces itself. They think strength looks like the person in the room, who takes up the most space, who talks over others, who moves through the world as though the world is required to accommodate them. That is one kind of strength. It is not the most durable kind. The more durable kind is the kind that shows up before dawn, when nobody is watching, and starts the fire. Kind that counts what it has and plans with what is actually there, rather than what should be there. The kind that sees the hungry child at the fence and leaves food without making a ceremony of it. Kind that carries the fear and does the work anyway, not because the fear is gone, but because the work is more important than the fear. Evelyn Rourke had walked into a yard where a man threw a ladle at her feet and other men laughed at the size of her body. She had picked the ladle up and made the only offer she had available and cooked supper with a sorry larder and bad flour and given 20 men a reason to sit at a table together without fighting. She had not done this because she was extraordinary. She had done it because she was paying attention and she was willing to do the work, and she had enough respect for the people she was feeding To give them her genuine effort rather than the minimum that would satisfy. That was in the end what the frontier asked of people. Not heroism, not perfection, not the absence of fear or failure or the wrong kind of tired. Just the willingness to show up honestly and do the actual work with whatever you actually had. She had shown up. She had done the work. She had built something in this cookhouse that she had not known she was building until it was already built, something that had fed 20 men through a Wyoming blizzard, that had reached 2 miles east to keep a family alive, that had taught a 12-year-old boy to make biscuits and given a 17-year-old young man enough foundation to build a future on. She had not done any of this perfectly. She had done it persistently and honestly, and with the full attention of a woman who understood that the people depending on her were worth being taken seriously. In the morning, the fire would need lighting. She would light it. That was enough. That had always been enough.